Awesome. Okay, so looks like my mic was muted that whole time.
Yes.
Ah, that sucks. Okay. Well, I can't redo that, so no going back now. Let's see. So I'll just give a brief rundown, guys. That sucks. I wish I didn't have that stupid mic muted. But yeah, we're doing the debate review from the Pericope Adulterae with Dr. Stephen Boyce and Dr. Jeff Riddle. If you guys are watching this, you probably know what to expect with that. But we're going to be looking at the internal, the external, and the historical evidence, and some of the comments that were made, and try to review some of those statements regarding the evidence for or against the PA. So, anyways, what I wanted to say to you all is we are on audio podcasts. You can, if you prefer audio only, we're on all the major audio podcasts, but also because we can't share it to multiple groups at one time anymore, I would ask if you're watching this, please share it in a group or post it to your timeline. That would be great to help us get the word out there. But one thing that Dr. Schnapp has agreed to do is when we get to the end of our conversation here today, he's going to open it up to you. If you want to call in with your questions, you can do that. And the number for that is, let me put it on the screen for you. Then the number for you to call in to is 816-866-0025. So there will be a chance for you to call in with your questions, or you can type them into whatever platform that you're watching live on, and we should be able to get that and get the question to Dr. Schnapp and go from there. So anyways, we are looking at the PA debate review and other text critical issues that we can get into today. There's a lot to cover, and we'll get into it. So anyways, thanks again, James, for coming on and being willing to have this conversation. I really appreciate it, and it's good to have you back, man.
It's good to be back. Thank you.
All right, so I think that we've got there's so many different places that we can go to start with this, but I think let's start off light. I've heard there's so much information floating around out there after this debate, and personally, I think that debates like this are useful. They need to happen, and I think that they will continue to happen to contend for what we believe is canonical, for what we believe is inspired, for what we believe is preserved, and whether or not ultimately it should or should not be in our Bibles. So that's something worth fighting for. That's something worth fighting over. And I think that I was talking to Dr. Boyce about this. We're all looking at the same evidence. But we're coming to different conclusions. And I think at the end of the day, it does come down to what is God doing throughout history with the Bible. Where's it at? I mean, we've got promises of preservation. We've got the promises of every jot and tittle being preserved. And where's it at? Where's the Bible throughout history? So, Dr. Schnapp, one of the accusations that I've heard is if you believe the PA should be in your Bible, that you're a TR only advocate or you're a King James only advocate. So I suppose that would have to apply to you as well, because you believe the PA is authentic. So how would you respond to that, just to start this off?
First, because you mentioned that there might be a polemic element in reactions to things, I probably should say first, I do not have an earned doctorate degree. I have an honorary Doctor of Divinity, but I do not, and of course I've done several research projects that were very large, but those were not, at an accredited university of any sort. My highest degree that I've earned is a Bachelor of Arts, so.
Okay.
That's probably the first point, just in case anybody says you're not a real doctor. I've never called myself a doctor, so hey, I'm being mistaken for.
I have to take doctor off of your name in the title, then.
That'd be fine. Preferable.
Oh man. Okay, so how do you respond to that? Are you TR only? Are you KJV only? What's going on here?
I am not KJV only. I am not TR only. I am not Byzantine priority. I subscribe to a position that I've developed called the equitable eclectic approach,
okay,
in which the Byzantine text is, the text that's in, at least in most places, Revelation's a special case, but in Matthew through Jude, you could probably say, and again, there are exceptions at some points here and there, but in general, the Byzantine text has a majority of at least 85% of the manuscripts.
Okay.
In the Gospels, there's a very strong core of the Byzantine readings.
Okay.
There's also a group called Family Pi, which is also represents the Byzantine text. It's more like what the earlier writers used, if you make comparisons. And the gist of equitable eclecticism is something I describe in an essay that's designed to describe it, and that's online. To sum it up, instead of Hort's theory that the Byzantine text was a created text created around the year 300, equitable eclecticism proposes that the Byzantine text existed, or at least a large core of Byzantine readings existed as an independent local text, just like they had in local text, in different locales, the text developed differently. And so you have an Egyptian text, you have something that's being used for the Old Latin, and you have in this vast area up in the north where, unfortunately, because of the weather, papyrus did not survive, you have this Byzantine text. But as soon as you get to the point where people start using parchment, and where the writings in that area start to be preserved, Cappadocia, other areas, you see them using a text that is predominantly Byzantine.
All right, that's a good introduction. That's a good answer there. Obviously, you're not TR only, you're not KJV only. And just because you believe that the PA should be in the Bible does not mean that you are TR or KJV only, but you are looking at the same evidence everybody else is and coming to a different conclusion, it seems like, than what an advocate for the critical text would come to. But Joe Tink says, and I hope I'm saying that right, appreciate James' work on John and the longer ending of Mark. So thank you for that comment there. We've got a comment that I think we need to get cleared up here. This is something that I would ask myself. We need to get an answer to this, James. So what's the definitive answer for the correct pronouncement? Is it Adulterae or Adulterae? I'm
not too worried about pronunciations. I probably have mangled quite a few terms myself because all I have to go on is what's written, and I don't travel to Europe to hear lectures and so forth. But I would say the usual pronunciation would be the Pericope Adulterae. But I've also heard Pericope Adulterae. So.
All right, now we're going to transition a little bit here and get into the meat of the discussion, but I do want to ask you this. This is something that you hear so often about these variants, and specifically about the longer ending of Mark, the PA, and 1 John 5:7. I know you and I would disagree there, but I think when it comes to any variant in the Bible, you'll hear that there is no change or effect on doctrine. So how would you respond to that? And specifically, how would you respond to, so that there would be a general question there. How would you respond to someone who says, regarding any of the variants, there's no doctrinal changes? And then how would you respond specifically with the PA? Are there any doctrinal changes with this particular variant?
Well, there are some variants that have clear doctrinal impact, but they don't have any chance of being original. Some of the old Latin readings can get pretty strange, but I would say that for the most part that is true. For the vast majority of readings, they don't have any severe doctrinal impact. That's not the only question to consider. There's also a question of how does it affect the interpretation, and that's a different question with a different answer. But probably if you go to say Mark 6:22, where in the Alexandrian text it says that the young girl who danced was Herod's daughter. That's not what Matthew says.
Yeah.
How you reconcile these two texts? Look in the NET and you'll see something to the effect of, and again, I'm not quoting the NET. I'm giving a general impression. But look at how various writers have handled those, and a lot of them say, we're just hoping for the best here, that there's a way to work this out, even though we might not have one.
Yeah.
Also, in Matthew 27:49, in the Alexandrian text, in the flagship manuscripts of the Alexandrian text, Sinaiticus Vaticanus, there's a reading about what happens to Jesus on the cross before he dies. Now, if you look in the Gospel of John, after Jesus dies, the soldiers come up because they want to make sure he's dead. They, instead of breaking his legs, they pierce him with a spear. And it's very clear in John that it's after he's dead that he's pierced and blood and water flow forth. In the Alexandrian text of Matthew, in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and some other manuscripts, there is a reading there, if you look back in Hort's text from 1881, you see it bracketed, and that says that when Jesus was still alive, and the people were saying, "Let's see if Elijah will come and save him," then somebody came up with a spear and pierced his side before he's dead. So I would say, well, it can't be both. Does anybody seriously think that Jesus was pierced and blood and water came forth from the wound after he died and before he died? So that's one case where I think that would have an effect on people's views of inerrancy. Now, if you look at how Dan Wallace has phrased the question do they have any real doctrinal impacts? Well, he says no, but then he also says no core doctrines. So there's a little bit of instead of just quoting Kenyon, those that really are aware of the problems will quantify what they mean by doctrines.
Oh.
Do they mean any doctrine that any Christian group anywhere teaches? Do they mean the core doctrines in the creeds? Or do they mean the doctrine of inerrancy? Because I think you can look at what Wallace has written and get the impression that he doesn't consider inerrancy to be a core doctrine, which is kind of strange because he teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary, which, if you go to the page, and the last time I checked, they list 7 essential teachings. I'm not sure if they're essential for what, but they're presented as essential for something. And inerrancy is one of those 7 essentials. Apparently, what is an essential on the website becomes non-essential in the classroom.
Yeah.
So there's room to say that definitely seems to affect the doctrine of inerrancy. Now, if you say, well, inerrancy is not a core doctrine, okay, your statement stands, but you've abandoned saying that inerrancy is a core doctrine.
Okay, so those are good points. I think this will be a good place to actually get into the debate. And a comment that we had that came into Facebook, and this may be a good place to start, and then I'll just follow your lead from here. Steve Hayes says, it's highly likely a scribal interpolation should be removed from modern editions of the Bible. So, James, how would you like to start our conversation as it's related to the actual debate between Dr. Boyce and Dr. Riddle? And specifically, maybe we can transition with that quote there from Facebook.
It sounds like something that Dan Wallace might say. But years back, there was a discussion along those lines, and several scholars, Kostermeyer, proposed, we should remove it to the footnotes. And it's funny that at the 2014 symposium on the Pericope Adulterae, at the end of the symposium, everybody, even the scholars, Wasserman, etc., who had come into the debate, opposing its authenticity, were saying, yes, we agree that this passage should be preached. So there's something there. But getting to the questions about why people have this position, that's where the evidence is involved. And you said we all look at the same evidence, but I don't think we're all looking at it at the same degree of magnification. And that's important because details matter, often quite a bit.
No, I'm with you 100% on that. I think a lot of it has to do with the weight and the methodology, the weight that we place on different manuscripts, the methodology that we use in the Greek texts that are being made and being updated. I think that has a lot to do with it. I think that our definitions of preservation and inerrancy have a lot to do with it. But that's my take on it. Robert Trulev writes in, he says, according to James Ussher, it meant that no text containing any core Christian doctrines in the received text are text critical concerns. How would you respond to that?
To really address Usher's concern there, and that particular question would probably take us down a rabbit hole. But
Okay.
so I'll just say, well, Usher's not our authority here. We still need to look at the evidence, not at Usher.
So
And
let's do that.
Usher, by the way, didn't have the same evidence we have.
Yeah. All right, so let's do that. Let's use this and jump into the debate. And for those of you who are watching live, I'm going to do my best to actually pull the clips from the debate as we go. That way you can watch it and listen to what is said. We'll go to what has been written, whether it's from Jeff Riddle or whether it's from James Snap or whether it's from Stephen Boyce. So we'll see where we go from here. But why don't you kind of take the lead, and I'll go with you.
Okay. Well, first, one of the first points that Dr. Boyce made was about the chapter headings in Codex A. Now, many manuscripts have chapter headings at the beginnings of the books. There were just these chapters. It was an easy way to find where you were before they had our chapters and verses. These aren't the same as the chapters that we have in our books. These were different. But he said the chapter lists don't have the Pericope Adulterae in them. Well, there's a form which became, in the course of time, a popular form that did have a chapter titled the Adulterae. Now, in Codex A, it doesn't. And so if you just look at that from a distance, if you back up, don't give anybody any information about, tell us the details about these chapter headings if they're so important. If you just say there's some chapter headings out there and they don't have the story of the woman caught in adultery in the list of chapters, you might not get an accurate idea. You might get a misimpression. You might be spreading misinformation and leading people to a conclusion that's not really justified by the evidence that you're describing. Because when you look at the chapter headings, now in Matthew there are 68 chapters in the old arrangement. In Mark there are 48, in Luke there are 83, but in John, in Codex A, there are just 18. These are much bigger chunks of text than the Synoptic Gospels. If you were to say there's no chapter heading, and so therefore this passage wasn't in there, what would you be taking out of the Gospel of John on that premise? If you approach the text with that premise, the premise that's inculcated by the use of that approach, that the assumption that if it's not in the chapter headings, it's probably not in the text. What were you missing, John? Do we know? Not if we're not told. So let's look and see. Let's look at the evidence a little bit more closely than what we saw in the previous debate. We wouldn't see in the chapter headings in Codex A anything about the preface about the beginning about in the beginning was the Word. We wouldn't see John the Baptist's testimony about the Lamb of God. We wouldn't see the call of Nathaniel. We wouldn't see the discourse in John chapter 6. We wouldn't see Jesus' attendance at the feast, which covers all of chapter 7. We wouldn't see the entire Good Shepherd discourse in chapter 10. We wouldn't see anything about the council's plot in chapter 11. We wouldn't see anything about Jesus' betrayals, trials, and crucifixion, and we wouldn't see anything about his post-resurrection appearances. In other words, we wouldn't see anything from John 20 or John 21. Now, how is that supposed to line up with the idea that the chapter headings have any real relevance to the question?
Okay, so let's take a step back for just a second. You're saying that Stephen Boyce says that the chapter headings are not in there regarding the PA, and you're making an argument that one, they are in earlier manuscripts, but two, and correct me where I'm wrong. I want to make sure that I'm following you here. But two, you're saying if the chapter headings are not there, then you've got all of these other stories that wouldn't be there as well. So correct me where I'm wrong and make sure I'm following you right there.
Okay, you're probably wrong, but it's not in the earlier manuscripts. Some manuscripts don't have any chapter headings at all, but in some later manuscripts, not all later manuscripts, but there is a later form of the chapter headings in a text of John in which John 7:53 through 8:11 is there.
I see.
And it looks like somebody, aware of the issue, made a point of expanding the chapter headings. Now, this was later on, well after Codex A.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the first thing. But in the Codex headings that are in Codex A, there are large passages, large chunks, much larger than the story of the woman caught in adultery, that are not covered in the chapter headings by being specifically named. There's no chapter in John, in these chapter headings, that says, oh, John appears to Mary. John appears, no, with the whole fisherman episode is not mentioned in the chapter headings. The call of Nathaniel, no, not in the chapter headings. John 5:19 through 46, that whole chunk isn't mentioned in the chapter headings. Jesus' attendance at the feast in John 7:1 through 59, a chunk of 59 verses. If you just went by the chapter headings, you have no idea it was there. So relying on people not knowing the chapter headings to use that as the basis to encourage the belief that the chapter headings provide evidence for the absence of the story of the woman caught in adultery is really not a good tactic at all.
I see.
If you're dealing with somebody who knows those chapter headings and has seen the evidence up close, it only works with people who don't know the details. As long as you look at it way out here.
I see. And you're saying that Dr. Boyce made that statement in the debate. Is that right?
I think if you look in minute 23, you'll see him refer to the chapter headings. That might not be the only time he does in the. I'm pretty sure in minute 23, he says chapter content laid out in a more ancient way in that document, which is Codex A, and is not in the listed 18 chapter references given in the manuscript. And that's supposed to mean something. Where actually, in real life, it doesn't any more than it would mean the resurrection appearances aren't there, because they're not in the chapter headings either.
I see. All right. Well, let's keep going then. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Oh yes, I was just expecting a question.
Nope. I'm sorry.
Well, the next point, if we just take it in chronological order, would be Dr. Boyce just said that there's P66 and P65. Well, he mentioned them both, and then stressed a line of a clean stream of transmission between P75 and Vaticanus. The term "clean stream" is never really defined, and you can when you're not working with clear definitions, there's a lot that you can throw in there that can't really be double checked. But I would point out that in the Nessel-Allen compilation, Vaticanus' text is preferred over P75, even though P75 is the earlier manuscript. But the text of Vaticanus is treated as the earlier text. They're not in a direct. They're not in a line of direct descendancy.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a question, or a comment rather, that's come in on the chapter headings. Joe Ham says, the chapter headings are not exhaustive and therefore prove nothing. How would you respond to a statement like that?
Joe Ham, you are 100% correct. All
right, and how does that relate to what Stephen Boyce said and what you're saying to correct what he said?
The most that you can extract from the chapter headings, looking at all the chapter headings, old and young, is that in the Middle Ages somebody made a point of adding the heading, no, this part's about the adulteress, to the 18 chapter headings that were already there. But those, again, are huge chunks of text. There's a lot of passages where if you or I were making chapter headings, we'd probably break it into paragraphs, like what you see in, say a study Bible that will have headings here and there. The headings in John are not like the headings in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, 68, 48, 83. John, 18. Much bigger chunks of text. So there's much less specificity in the titles. If you were to try to use just those titles to say, there's no chapter title for this and therefore it's not there, which is the impression that Boyce's approach would tend to give, I would suspect. There's a whole lot you could say wasn't there. The things that I just described.
I see. So that's where the weight of whether the chapter headings are there is being used for or against whether something is or is not authentic. And specifically, if it's used to say that the PA is inauthentic, you're saying, well, it's a meaningless argument. You can't use it for the PA to say it's inauthentic because That would mean all these other passages that don't have the chapter headings are inauthentic as well. Okay, so we've got, regarding the clean stream argument, you're saying that it's not defined very well, if at all, and that getting a definition for what the clean stream is would be pretty important to the discussion. So maybe you could make it a little more clear for us what the clean stream argument is, and then I've got a comment that's come in regarding P75 and P66 with the clean stream argument, and I'll see what your take would be on that.
Okay, P66 was mentioned, but that wasn't really part of the framework of the argument. It just kind of came up, and then we never saw it again, did we? So because P66, you can't really draw the kind of connection to the same transmission line that you can as tightly with a P75 and Vaticanus. But and also we sometimes think, well, it's P75, it's big, it's a big manuscript, right? There's a lot of the book that's missing in P75. But the thing to see is that they are related texts, but they also disagree quite a bit. There are things in P75 that aren't in Vaticanus. There are readings in Vaticanus that aren't in P75. Their similarity is sometimes statistically overplayed, and they still have lots of disagreements. If you would say they only disagree 5% of the time, well, it depends on how close you look at the details. So that's
okay. Okay, so regarding that, we've got a comment that came in on Facebook from Tommy Wasserman. He says, Snap thinks the PA was assigned a chapter in the Middle Ages. That happened earlier on. How would you respond to that?
Okay. When does he think the earliest? When does he think the earliest point is? Middle Ages. Different people define that different ways.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. We'd get clarification on and come back to it. I want to follow up on the clean stream argument and what you just said about P66 and P75. Stephen Avery says this. He says the clean stream argument is worthless. He says Brent, and I might be saying this wrong, Brent Nongbury has clearly shown that P75 fits very well as 4th century. And then he says P66 was removed from the discussion. He says the terminus post cum of P75 is about 500, and the 200 AD date was a worthless conjecture. It could be early, but it could be much later. How would you respond to that?
I'd just say regarding Nongbury's redating, that's not a consensus on that. There have been some scholars who Orsini has looked into P66 especially, and I would not put a hard date of 200s on P66. I would broaden that range.
Okay.
P75 is a different story, and we would have to get into the study of the script and some tall grass to get into that.
Okay.
But I would say I would stick with a date around 200, which could be as late as 225 or a little bit more for P75. I would stick with the general late 100s, early 200s date for P75.
Okay, and I want to stick with this and keep our conversation flowing here, but I do want to tell Robert Truelove we're going to come back to this. This is going to be a point of the conversation that we're going to spend a little bit of time on, where you say that you have not read, you corrected this statement, you said you have not read Boyce's paper on the PA, which we'll bring up, I'll pull it up on the screen. But I did understand correctly from their debate that he was claiming out of quote-unquote 300 unseals, only 15 has the PA. As if all 300 unseals has that section in John's Gospel, which we'll come back to that. So just hang with us, and we'll get there. So let's see. Where do you want to go from there?
Tommy, I don't have your book handy. I had to go to Interlibrary alone for that book, and but you have your book, right? So you should be able to look in there and find what the earliest point was at which that the chapters were expanded. But the point is, though, that Codex A was the manuscript that was being pointed to, and it's clearly wasn't before Codex A, at least not in Codex A's transmission stream.
Okay.
The default form of the chapters in John have 18 chapters, the ones that I just have been referring to this whole time. The later form, later than Codex A, has the 19, but But in the medieval manuscripts, some have 19, but some have 18 too.
All right. And I've got to ask this for somebody who's not as up to date on all that information as someone like you or Tommy Wasserman are. Why is that important? Whether there's 18 chapters or 19 chapters, what's the point of the argument there?
It's just a peripheral point about when did the 19th chapter appear, or the 10th chapter assigned to the story of the adulteress. When did it start to be presented?
Good. Okay.
But referring to descriptions of the evidence, we have this statement that the story is in over 1,000 Greek texts. And again, it's not that we're not looking at the same evidence, but how closely are we looking at it? If you look in the New King James Bible, you'll see a footnote that says, no, over 900 manuscripts have this story.
Yeah.
Well, that was 1982. Since 1982, if we were to go back and count, and make a precise count, would we still be saying over 900? No. Now we say almost 1,500. And I believe Dr. Riddle had the precise count from Morris Robinson. I think I've got it here. 1,476 have at least some text of the story of the woman caught in adultery. 1,476, and 267 don't have any text at all from the story of the woman caught in adultery. So you could extrapolate a ratio of about 1,500 have it, about 275 don't, or a ratio of roughly 15:3, which comes out to about 85% of the manuscripts in favor of including the story of the woman caught in adultery. So we wouldn't say 900, we wouldn't saying 1,000. We wouldn't, if we wanted to be precise, we'd say 1,476 versus 267 plus whatever's come up since 2014. There have been a few manuscripts found and confirmed and cataloged since even that statement was made. But that was reasonably close, though. You can go with that kind of ratio.
So let's take a second to look. I've got Pickering's notes up here from his commentary on the PA, and he says some 15% of the Greek manuscripts omit 753 through 811, including most of the early ones, but that means that 85% contain it, including the Latin tradition that dates from the 2nd century. Assuming for the sake of the argument that the passage is spurious, how could it have ever intruded here into such effort that it is attested by some 85% of the manuscripts? Let's try to read the larger passage without these verses. We must go from 752 to 812 directly. Reviewing the context, the chief priests and Pharisees had sent officers to arrest Jesus to no avail. A discussion ensues. Nicodemus makes a point, to which the Pharisees answer. 752, are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet is arisen out of Galilee. 812, then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. And then he gets into the grammatical argument on the internal side of the conversation. But let me cut that back to you, James. I want to get your take on this. How do you think that the statistics regarding the percentages would flow in a conversation like this for or against the PA? And specifically, he transitions from that side of the argument to the internal critique regarding the grammar.
Well, I wouldn't depend on the ratio. I'm simply pointing out, if we, as a point of observation, what is the evidence? Then, before you can get to a stage of interpreting the evidence, we need to know what the evidence is. And so, as a simple point of saying what does the how many manuscripts have it, how many don't, there might be some people somewhere in the world that might think from what you read in some commentaries, wow, hardly any manuscripts have this passage. And I just would like to make the point in terms of simply observing, before we analyze and see whether that means anything or not. The raw numbers favor inclusion by 85%.
Okay. All right, that makes a lot of sense. So you would agree with Pickering if you're looking at the percentages there, that the total number of manuscripts would agree in 85%.
There's one point I would clarify, which is that he mentioned that the Latin line supports the inclusion of the story of the woman caught in adultery. Not 100% of the Latin line, certainly. Yeah, there's early Latin support for it, but there's also some on the other side.
Yeah. Okay, so now relevant to what you just stated about the Latin being dated back to the 2nd century and containing it, Robert Truelove asks this relating to the dating of it back to at least the 2nd century. Is there any serious argument out there that is made that the PA doesn't date back to the 2nd century, regardless of whether it originated in John's Gospel?
Yes, regarding the Old Latin, we should probably back up and look at just a few general points. In the Old Latin, one of the questions is, when did the Old Latin get started? Because there are various lines of transmission within the Old Latin line.
Right.
Some represent Africa, some represent different places, and they don't all agree. It's part of the Western transmission line, and as Jerome and Augustine mentioned later on, by the late 300s, early 400s, they felt like we're facing a situation where anybody that knows Latin and Greek thinks they can just pick up the New Testament and make themselves a translation in Latin, and that's why the Vulgate was introduced so there would be some kind of standard. But in the Old Latin, we see around the year 180, in a transcript of a persecution called the Acts of the Scoletan Martyrs, there's a reference, and it doesn't specify those are Latin books, but there's a reference where the Roman person who's in charge of the trial asked the Christian, "What do you have as cases of yours?" And the Christian, according to the transcript, says, "Oh, those are the letters of a man named Paul. He was a righteous man." And it's just this casual point that's part of the transcript, but because it's so casual, because it doesn't look like anybody's trying to prove anything, it gives a great amount of verisimilitude that there was a Latin translation, because it's in Carthage. It's where Latin tended to predominate. That's our first glimpse of saying there's an Old Latin translation there of some kind. We don't know which one it was, but there was something there. If we build on that and say we have an Old Latin of some sort, there were different transmission lines. By the 300s, Hugh Houghton, in his book on the Latin New Testament, but also before Houghton, way back in like 1910, a French scholar, and I mentioned him at my blog and provide his data there. He did a comparison of the chapter titles in Old Latin copies, and these would be not just Old Latin, but also Vulgate copies, because sometimes, as time went on, the Old Latin got superseded by the Vulgate. But lots of folks still liked the bells and whistles around the Old Latin. They liked the book introductions, for example. And so you might have a Vulgate text, but it's accompanied by a book introduction from the Old Latin. So when we look at the Old Latin capitula is like a chapter, the chapter summaries, and again, it's not our 21 chapters, but whatever division they had back then, and it varied. But if you look at the Old Latin chapter summaries, there's one particular form where, when they summarize the chapter, there's readings that tend to agree with the readings that were used by Cyprian, who was a bishop there at Carthage in the mid 200s.
Yeah.
And so it looks like the text that Cyprian was using was probably the same text used by the people that made this particular form of the Old Latin chapter summaries. So the text, the manuscripts in which we find these chapter summaries are much later. But the thing to see is that chapter summary is matching up with the text that was much earlier, that
right.
seems to be contemporary with Cyprian, or maybe only slightly later than Cyprian, which would make it virtually 50 years there, virtually as old as the oldest evidence in the papyri for the
right.
non-inclusion of the story of the woman caught in adultery.
See, and why that is significant to me is because it's generally accepted that the Old Latin would be traced back to Tertullian, that he would have brought it from the Greek into the Latin around 137 AD. So when
wrong number.
Okay, correct me. I mean, yeah, correct me where I'm wrong. So, but what's the weight of the Old Latin in this conversation, or any conversation regarding text criticism, for that matter?
Tertullian has been interpreted different ways, but I would say the most probable case of what Tertullian is doing. He's probably translating as he goes. We don't see a lot of Old Latins where you can say, oh, this is the Old Latin text that Tertullian was using because he always agrees with this Old Latin text. That doesn't happen. Tertullian's probably translating from Greek. Now, that doesn't mean that there was no Old Latin anywhere.
Right.
Latin manuscripts don't get translated and then suddenly appear everywhere. So there was a process. If you look at what Jerome and Augustine say, it looks like anybody, anywhere, anytime might just decide, hey, we need an Old Latin text. We need a Latin text. Let's make one.
Yeah.
So so I wouldn't say that we can definitely nail down a particular Latin version to a particular time as being the earliest possible time for it. 137 is too early, but 250 is too late. Probably the old Latins that we are engaged with.
Yeah. And that
before the time of the Vulgate.
And that might be getting into the weeds too much to try to figure out why you would say 137 is too early, 250 is too late. But let's see what your response is here. You mentioned Jerome and you mentioned Augustine. Stephen Avery says the great failing of the PA debate was the minimal emphasis given on the incredible evidences of Augustine and Ambrose, who specifically referenced the section being dropped as a conscious decision, and also Jerome essentially proving its antiquity and authenticity. So it seems like there's significant weight that's placed on these three church fathers, Augustine, Ambrose, and Jerome. 1.1 being Augustine and Ambrose reference a time when the section was dropped as a conscious decision, and then Jerome showing the antiquity and the authenticity to it. So what would your take be on those three church fathers regarding the PA?
Well, regarding Jerome and Augustine, and you could throw Ambrose in there too. These two guys weren't just your church father.
Yeah.
Jerome, we're talking about the man who was the scholar of his generation, a man who knew Hebrew, which hardly any Christians of his era bothered with. We're talking about the man who gave the church a translation that was the dominant text in Europe for the next 1,000 years. And then with Augustine, we're talking about a man who gave the church a good part of its theology for the next several centuries. Now, these two were very influential. So you would think that once you have a statement from Jerome or a statement from Augustine, these two almost revered individuals who came to be revered individuals later on, in their own lifetimes, it might be a different story. But when you have their statements, most people say, well, why should I bother giving my minor league opinion when I've got Hank Aaron and Willie Mays giving their opinion?
Okay, so we've got a response specifically regarding the Old Latin, and probably something to do with what we're talking about with Augustine and Ambrose and Jerome. Tommy Wasserman says, yes, and it speaks strongly for the interpolation of the PA, first into the Western text, and it appears in the bilingual Boyce, first in the manuscripts. The Old Latin tradition has a lot of peculiar interpolations.
That it does, but none of them are quite this big, are they? We have in Codex Boyce, we have an interpolation or two. One that looks like might as well be a paraphrase of another passage. But in Codex Boyce, we don't have the same line that we see in some of the Old Latin. We still have to answer the question: how did these Old Latin capitula get there? And when it comes to the Latin versus the Greek question, when we see so much Latin support for it, one of those Latin writers was Ambrose, and Ambrose's and Tommy Wasserman, if you got your book handy, you could turn the page here. Ambrose's Latin text seems to imply a Greek-based text. Now, the text that Ambrose is using has a particular nuance that implies that it was made from the Greek when he's using the Pericope Adulterae. So, if it's in Greek before Ambrose, and it's in Latin from Greek, where did it come from if not from Greek? So the question that would instill, the question that would elicit or provoke would be not how did it get there, but how did it go away?
That's a good point. Okay, so let's keep going in the conversation. Obviously, Tommy has followed up with the Beze manuscript, saying we have an extremely long text of Acts, by the way, and that he's coming out with a later chapter regarding Ambrose text later this year. So he's saying that it was interpolated into the Western text in Greek. So how would you respond to that, specifically with Beze? And then how he's saying that it's interpolated into the Western text in Greek. So it doesn't seem like he's really putting much weight on it coming from the Latin, but being interpolated from the Greek into the Greek.
Well, if it's interpolated into the Western text in Greek, then you have it there, at the point where Codex Beza is made. Now, obviously, I can't interact with a book that hasn't been published yet, so that point might just have to wait.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's keep going, man. Where are we going next?
To what Stephen Boyce proceeded to say after the undefined clean stream, we got to the point about variations in the location of the Pericope Adulterae, which was that family one, almost 17 manuscripts place the story at the end of John. And you'll often see in footnotes, for instance, in the I think the latest edition of the Holman, I think the name Holman's been dropped. So just the Christian Standard Bible, you'll see a footnote that says this passage is found in various locations. For instance, at the end of John, or before, after John 7:36. Look at the footnote; you can see the exact wording. But it gives the impression that this passage was floating around looking for a place to land. And if you look at some of Dan Wallace's lectures, you'll get this definite impression. Bruce Metzger also gives the same impression. 225 has it at John 7:36. Family 13 has it after Luke 21. And you also see this phrase from Dr. Boyce. 1333 also places it at the end of Luke 34:53. Where to begin? Family 1, its chief representatives, number 1582, have a note for the story of the woman caught in adultery appears at the end of John. And the note says, again, go to my blog for the exact wording, but the gist of it is, this manuscript isn't found in a lot of manuscripts. Lots of our favorite commentators don't mention it, but we found it in our manuscript. But to defer to Chrysostom and some others, we've moved it from its usual place in section 86, which is another way of using Eusebius's cross-reference system to where we see it in John 7, right after John 7:52. We moved it from section 86 to here at the end of John. They make the specific note saying, we did find it in John, but we moved it to here. So that needs to be considered. When the note is not mentioned, when you just say, sometimes it's at the end of John, and you don't say, because somebody, as they specifically said in the note, if you care to look at the note and tell people about the note, anybody can see it was in John at the usual place before it was moved to the end of John. That note is very important when you're considering the implications of finding it at the end of John. The implication is not that it was floating, but an implication that it was transplanted. Likewise, manuscript 225. 225 is an unusual manuscript because it's partly lectionary. It's been modified to conform, to an extent, to the election cycles. And 225 also moves the first bit of John chapter 13, because that's how it was used around Easter time.
So let's take just a second. I want to sit on this point that you just made real quick. One, the argument is being made now that it didn't come from the Latin into the Greek. It came from the Greek and was interpolated into the Greek. So it was an addition. Whether the story is true, that it actually happened historically or not, I don't think that's what's being disputed, and that's not an argument that you've made for or against it. Obviously, you're arguing that it is historically an event that took place, but you're also arguing that it's authentic, and you're saying that it was not interpolated from the Greek into the Greek. But we've got some specifically in the conversation that we're having with that Tommy Wasserman brought up, it was interpolated into the Greek and isn't in the same location that it's found in other manuscripts. So one, it seems like we've got an argument that it's interpolated, but we don't know who brought it in. We don't know when it was brought in. We don't even have any arguments for those claims. So that would seem significant to me. Why didn't anybody recognize it? Why didn't anybody say, why is this coming in? What's the authority behind this? Nobody questioned it. But you're pointing out that we've got a note here that is saying that where it came from, specifically with family one. So I think that's something to consider. But Tommy says here, and I want to get your take on this before we move into your second point here. He says, James, the Scholion you're now talking about is actually an early evidence for the assignment of a kephalion into the PA, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, but let's take on that.
Chapter title, yeah.
Okay, so yeah.
Well, if Tommy or anybody wants to argue that the heading name for the story of the woman caught in adultery was introduced earlier and earlier than what we saw to the manuscripts, I'm fine with that. If he wants to say, if somebody is out there saying, no, the story of the woman caught in adultery had its own chapter title, not in the Middle Ages, but way back further than that. Okay, have your way. That's great. I don't see how that hurts my case. It really touches any of the points that I'm making. That's a nice bit of peripheral information there. Please proceed. But again, I can't interact with a book or now an article that's going to be coming out later on.
Okay.
But going back to what I mentioned, 115 has it after John 8:12. 225 has it after John 7:36. And again, we get this far. We just get to the point where to the point of saying it moves around. It moves around. But we don't get to the point anywhere in the footnotes or anywhere in Dr. Boyce's debate to answer the question, why is it moved around? And there is an easy answer for this question. John 7:37 is where the Pentecost lection begins. The lection that was read in the church at this major feast day, the same feast they're celebrating there on Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. No, the Feast of Pentecost was one of the major feasts of the early church. On Pentecost, the reading was John 7:37 through 7:52, plus, it didn't end there, because it'd be kind of a low note to say, we're going to end today's celebratory reading with no prophet comes out of Galilee. So they included John 8:12, no, I am the light of the world. And that's where they finished up the lection for Pentecost. Now, for a person reading the lection for Pentecost, reading this, and by the person reading, I say the lector. This was an office or a function in the early church where this was the person assigned to be the reader. Most of the people weren't literate, so you would have somebody who had a good voice, who could read the text to them. So the lector would have the text for Pentecost.
Yeah.
What's happening there in 226 is somebody saying, let's make the lector's job a little bit easier, and instead of making him read the Pentecost lection and have to and depend on him to make that jump from the end of 752 down to chapter 8 verse 12, we're going to put the lection before the Pentecost reading. That's what you're seeing happening there, and that's all there is to it. It's not that the text was floating around and they said, well, let's just put it here in John chapter 7. It's right there at the specific spot before the Pentecost lection begins.
All right, so I've got to point this out. Some people say that James Snap places too much weight on the lectern cycle, the lectern readings, and specifically with the PA, that it would be something that would work against you to support the PA. So specifically regarding the lectionaries, and in particular with this variant, where was it circulating? Where was it being read? Why are the lectionaries important regarding the PA when obviously you're saying that it's not something that's a weight against it? So where would you go with that response?
I would say when you start looking into it, you'll see that that footnote, which, if you just have the bare footnote, you would just scratch your head and say, well, I don't understand why it's moved around to these different locations. When you have an awareness of the lection cycle, it starts to make more sense. The information that the election about the shape of the election reading on Pentecost, you won't have to wonder like Dan Wallace seems to wonder. Did somebody just come in here and write it afterwards? No. 115 puts the story of the woman caught in adultery after 1812 because that's after the Pentecost election, and 226 likewise has it before the Pentecost election. That's why it's at these particular locations. 1333 is a special case. In 1333, what happened was somebody made a manuscript of the Gospels that did not have the story of the woman caught in adultery in it, but somebody later on wanted to use that copy of the Gospels when they were reading lections. The lection for St. Pelagia's Day, October, was not there, and so they put it in there. But it's not like it was just floating around, and you can't use 1333 to support the case that it was just floating around and somebody decided to put it here between Luke and John. That's not what happened. It wasn't floating around. How do we know it wasn't floating around when 1333 was made and was supplemented? We know because it has a title. It has the title to it that says, this is the lection for St. Pelagia's Day, and this came from John. Does Stephen Boyce say anything about that? No, he did not. And neither does, I think, anybody that has written about this in detail before 5 years ago point out that in 1333 that says, they just say, oh, sometimes this passage is at the end of Luke. First of all, it's not the whole passage. It is the lection for St. Pelagia's Day, which predominantly was just just chapter 8, verses 3 through 11. That's what you see in 1333. You don't see the whole story of starting with then everybody went home. You don't see that there. You just see the part that is specifically identified, and I mentioned that specifically, identified in the text. Look at the page and you'll see it. There's a picture of it at my blog. Look at the page and you'll see the title that says, here's the lection for St. Pelagia's Day, which is taken from from John.
Okay.
And so using 1333 to encourage or provoke the impression that this passage was just floating around is either you don't know what you're doing and you're acting like you do, or else you know what you're doing and you're misrepresenting the evidence. Neither option is good.
All right, so let's take a second and talk about that. Robert Truelove says, the lectern cycle argument makes a lot of sense to me in relation to the floating tradition argument. I've never heard a solid rebuttal to this observation. And Tommy Wasserman says specifically about the Pentecost lection, he says, the Pentecost lection 7 through 8:12 was assigned from copies lacking the PA. Once it was interpolated in some manuscripts, not all, it had to be skipped or it could be relocated. Yes. So how would you, obviously you've been responding to this a bit, but specifically regarding the interpolation and it having to be skipped, how would you respond to that? Because that seems like something a little different.
It seems like Tommy's relying on some later sources for a definition of what is the Pentecost lection. Look in the actual lectionaries, and it's clear what the Pentecost reading is. It starts at 737, goes to the end of 752, and jumps to 811. I don't know why anybody would have any other impression unless he's using a rather late or anomalous basis for the claim. And again, I can't interact with books that haven't been written yet. In minute 37, getting back to the debate, there's a statement that says, out of the 1,000, really should be the 1,000. Robinson's number, which is much higher. Out of that, we need to recognize there's numerous streamed readings coming together to make one story. That doesn't. You could say things like that for practically any a passage in the New Testament. You could say, well, we see the Byzantine stream, we see the Western stream, we see the Alexandrian stream. How do we get to the point where we can say there was one stream before all of those? So that seems like an easy point to absorb.
So what specifically was Stephen saying there? Do you want me to play that in the debate?
Uh, it was just a statement that there's numerous streamed readings coming together to make one story. There's nothing unusual about there being more than one stream with its own set of readings for a particular section of text. That was around minute 37. But going on from there, he mentions that Papias was familiar with the story. He kind of backed off on that later in the debate, so I won't pursue it too much.
Okay.
But the claim that Papias definitely, clearly is referring to the story of the woman caught in adultery in John is an open question. Eusebius just doesn't get specific enough in his description of Papias to really pull apart what he's referring to. Now, if we had Papias's, if I call Papias Papyrus,
I know what you mean.
But Papyrus says there was this other story, and again, Eusebius isn't clear if he means another story like the one we know from John, or just another story that was made, one of many stories. So that's
So let's take a second on that one. So you've got people who say that when we've got these early quotations of a woman that is either caught in sin or some sort of variation with that terminology, that it's not really relevant to the PA because it's not specific enough. And you're saying, well, what else could it be? What specifically are you saying in response to that?
I'm saying Papias had this book of the sayings of the Lord, or the teachings of the Lord, and when you look at some of the copies, it looks like there's been this merging of two streams. One is John, and one is something that might be what was in Papias's books. And we don't have Papyrus's books, but we do have different forms of the story, or simply different stories. And if you look in an important Armenian manuscript, it used to be called Etchmidiatsin 229. Now it's cataloged as Matanadaran 2374. And this has a story of a woman taken in sins. And when that's the beginning, what follows is usually not the same as what we see in John. But you can see how a person with a copy of the Gospel of John, who came to the story of the woman caught in adultery and it was missing, might say, "There's something missing here. We should supplement this faulty manuscript with that story." Oh, we have Papyrus's book here that has a very similar story, and so it begins to be blended together.
Okay,
that's where some of the variants come from.
Right.
Not to spend too much time on this to account for some of those variants.
Right.
But in the text from this Armenian manuscript, which again is just an echo of a much older text, it says, "A certain woman was taken in sins, against whom all bore witness that she was deserving of death. They brought her to Jesus to see what he would command, in order that they might malign him. Jesus made answer and said, 'Come, ye who are without sin, cast stones and stone her to death.' But he himself, bowing his head, was writing with his finger on the earth, to declare their sins, and they were seeing their several sins on the stones. And filled with shame, they departed, and no one remained but only the woman. Saith Jesus, Go in peace, and present the offering for sins, as in their law is written." Now that's clearly not John 7:53 through 8:11. It is a story about a woman caught in sins, and we see how a guy as early as Papyrus could know that tradition and write it down in his books. And we can see how people might connect the two. There are some points of parallel. We can also see how people familiar with the story could say, I like that detail. Let's put that in our text of John, just because it has a reliable line of transmission going back to Papyrus's books. But that's the idea that Papyrus has to be referring to the story of the woman caught in adultery in John is not a proven point.
Okay, so that's something good to point out, specifically with the references from the early church writers to a woman caught in sins, and how that can be used for or against the PA. But regarding the lectionary cycles, Tommy Wasserman says the Pentecost lection does not contain the PA in the Byzantine liturgy. It has to be skipped. He says in the manuscript, this is indicated with signs for skipping. So why, and I know you touched on that earlier, but specifically this seems like it's a point that so many people are using to put a lot of weight that it's not authentic because it wasn't in. It was put in there to be skipped. So how would you respond to that?
Oh, if I could just write that into the sky. The Pentecost lection does not contain the PA in the Byzantine liturgy. It has to be skipped, and it's marked for skipping. Really, the question is, how far back does this custom of marking it that way go? Before there were lectionaries, there were continuous text manuscripts, and if we're going to say in the manuscript it's indicated with signs for skipping, yeah, those signs were meant for the lector, so that when he was reading the Pentecost lection year by year, he would be reading along in his copy of John, because they didn't have the individual segments yet in lectionaries. They just had the lectionary cycle. Excuse me, the lection cycle. And the feast of Pentecost, being such a major feast, would be one of the first days to have a reading assigned to it. Picture a copyist in the early church, very early church. I'm talking 2nd century, and he's in a locale where they're celebrating Pentecost, and they use this text. And it doesn't mean that he's using a Byzantine text, but the idea is that the Byzantine text relied on the same tradition of what text do we use to celebrate Pentecost. Right. If they're using John 7:37 through 52, and then skipping down to chapter 8, verse 11, it's not hard to picture. And again, we don't have videotape, but it's easy to picture a copyist saying, "Let's make things a little simpler for our dear friend, the lector. In our copy of John, we're going to give him instructions," and maybe there's a new lector that needs a little instruction. We don't want him reading the story about the woman caught in adultery. That has nothing to do thematically with Pentecost, with the coming of the Holy Spirit. So when we get to chapter 752 in the manuscript, we'll put a little note there in the margin. Just not a thorough sentence, but just a note, jump ahead. And those marks that Tommy mentioned there in the comments, they would simply, jump ahead, euperbole, right, and then goes down to auction to resume here. So skip away here, jump down, pick it up here. Yeah. The lector who's got such a manuscript would understand what it meant. Right. However, put that kind of manuscript in the hands of an early professional copyist, and it's a different story. We don't know if a professional copyist is even has ever attended a single church service. He might be somebody that's just hired for the job that the church thinks is good at his job. Yeah. He might be a professional, like what we see in Papyrus 46, that at the end of the books he'll say, "By the way, this is how many lines I've made. Yeah. So pay me the going rate for that many lines." We see that in the Egyptian text there in P46. So if you have a copyist, a very good one, a meticulous one, a copyist who does what a copyist is supposed to do, which is the copyist who replicates his master copy to the best of his ability, who doesn't think, should I do this? Should I not do this? No. Who will just follow orders. Yeah.
Okay, so let's...
Wait.
No, you got it.
Give him a manuscript of John that has marks in it that says, you know where the lection begins, here's where you skip ahead, and then here is where you resume. That's fine for the lecture, but now give that to the copyist who doesn't know about the lection system. He sees these notes in his manuscript that says, skip ahead at this point, and pick things up down here. What does the meticulous copyist do? The disciplined copyist, the one who follows orders. What does he do with the text that says, skip from here down to here? Yeah. He skips from here down to here. That's what he does. And thus, the intervening text, the story of the woman caught in adultery, disappears from that particular transmission line. Okay. Once that text is in place and it receives a certain amount of attention from other copyists, the text of John begins to be circulated without those 12 verses. Yeah. If you let that text then influence subsequent lines, it maintains a particular amount of influence.
Okay, so I've got a two-part follow-up on that, and this is something I wanted to ask earlier. But thank you, Matthew Murphy Rose, to bring this up, because it brought it back to my thought to ask this. He says many portions of text are skipped by the lection system. So that's point number one. But Tommy is following up with it, and he says, yeah, Acts 2 was likely there first, and also the John 7:53 through, well, he puts a smiley face there. Yeah, Acts 7:53, well, through 7:39. I might be reading that wrong. But he says, my point, James, is that the lection was assigned in the first place from a copy that lacked the PA. Therefore, it had to be skipped when it was there in the manuscript or relocated. That he's not arguing, he's not talking about what the copyists do at all. He's saying that they are reading from a lectern cycle that comes from a text that doesn't have it in there. So it seems like, I mean, if that's what it is, then we should be able to produce a text that they were using based off of that lectern cycle to say, well, this is the text they used.
So I think you noticed that I'm following along the comments here, not always keeping up entirely because I'm also talking. But Tommy's saying, yes, Acts 2 was likely first there. You'll see a lot of likelies when it comes to questions about how closely was the later Byzantine lection system applied in a particular locale, from which neither Tommy nor I have detailed indications of written hard copies of exactly what lection system they were doing. We do see in the book of Acts Pentecost being celebrated. We do see later on in the Byzantine system the story of the woman caught in adultery is not there in the text for Pentecost. The question that Tommy, and getting back to Stephen, would need to account for is, why would anybody put this story into the Pentecost lection at that point in the text? Because there's nothing that comes before it, there's nothing that comes after it that would naturally say, oh yes, this is where it goes. Of all places to put it, why would you put it there?
Yeah.
It's one point that I think if you look in Tommy's book, he never really explains that. He goes off into later sources about the Byzantine lectionary and never really answers that question. But that's not really the focus of what we're talking about today. We're looking back at what Stephen Boyce said in his debate, was my understanding. So, but to pursue that a little further, Tommy, and now I feel like I'm talking to the comments. But when you have the Pentecost lection there, and when you have and continuous text copies, before we have a lectionary, we have continuous text copies. We have that implied in the Old Latin capitula. So you need to find a way to explain, why would anybody, before the Old Latin line, using Greek, put the story into that particular point in the text before they had the Byzantine lectionary cycle?
Okay, I think we've addressed the lectionary cycle. We've addressed the idea that it was a Greek interpolation from Greek into the Greek. When you're showing, obviously, we don't have any support for that. It seems like a conjecture, and maybe an unsupported conjecture. So let's move to your next point. I know that we want to spend some more time on the actual debate. So let's try to get back to it.
Yeah, getting back to the question of why did people put it here, according to the theory that happened. Dr. Boyce at one point tried to make a connection. I think he's echoing Gordon Fee at this point, to the effect that there was this big ceremonial scene that was going on in Jerusalem, that without the PA it really comes together well, but with the PA it's disrupted into two different scenes, and I would consider it. I would argue the exact opposite. First of all, John's using the usual dates for the Gospel of John is not writing to a readership that is particularly familiar with Jerusalem. By the time John's writing, the temple's been destroyed, and you would have to be rather optimistic to think, oh yes, people will catch on, even though John says, okay, I'm not going to mention this ceremony that was going on about the pool of Siloam and these lanterns and all that. I'm just going to assume that my readers are going to know what I'm talking about, and they'll see this beautiful, nuanced point that I'm making, but I won't mention anything about the actual ceremony. Meanwhile, if you look at the text in John, before the story of the woman caught in adultery, the religious leaders are in their own private meeting, and that's the last we see them. When they're talking and they're saying, look in your text, Nicodemus, nobody comes out of Galilee. They're off by themselves. They're not with Jesus. They're having this discussion. And then in chapter 8, verse 12 and verse 13, look it up and you'll see all of a sudden Jesus and the Pharisees are right back there. You have to posit at some point, either you have to posit that, well, John just posited a new group of Pharisees for chapter 8, but because the last time we see the Pharisees in chapter 7, if you're looking without the story of the woman caught in adultery, they're off by themselves in a private consultation with themselves and with Nicodemus. Chapter 8, verse 13, all of a sudden they're back here with Jesus. Now this movement makes perfect sense when you have the story of the woman caught in adultery in the picture. It's just unexplained without the story of the woman caught in adultery. So I would say the narrative evidence of the internal evidence of narrative flow works in favor of inclusion, not in favor of omission. That's that point.
That's good. And I'm reading the comments. We've got some more comments going back to the lectionaries. One point is, one question that came up was, what's the earliest lectionary that we have? What's the significance of that? And then Tommy Wasserman follows up with that, where he says, one thing that's entirely crucial to understand the development of the lectionary as far as it can be understood, study what was preached in Constantinople during Pentecost. What did they read there? Severiano Gabala, for example, in several sermons where clearly the text was read first. So, and we're backpedaling a little bit here, but I think it's something that it seems like people seem like to think that it's a very important point regarding the PA, whether for or against it. So how would you respond to those 2 points there?
Tommy seems to be focused on lectionaries. What I'm talking about is a lection cycle, something that was not systematically developed like a lectionary when you have a reading for every day. A lection cycle is more basic. It's like what you have in some churches where you kind of know that at Easter time you're going to hear something about the resurrection passages from somewhere in the Gospels. You're probably not going to hear. You probably haven't heard very many Easter time sermons from Jude or 1 Peter, because the focus is on the events of the resurrection, the events you're celebrating. A lection cycle is like that. And when we have a major feast like Pentecost, I reckon that, and I think anybody that looks on them would agree, that the early feast developed first. Gregory, who was, as in Gregory Allen, C.R. Gregory proposed that the Sunday and Saturday lections, probably pretty early, maybe as early as the 2nd century. Now, not everybody agreed with him, but that's Gregory. When it comes to the lection cycle, can anybody really picture Pentecost being celebrated without anybody planning, without anybody having any idea of which text they were going to use? I don't think that's a intrinsically probable point. So when we see what text they were using, where do we look? Well, one place is in the later on in the lectionaries, and we see that's what the lection has, and it has this particular trait that fits and explains the omission of these 12 verses according to the scenario that I just described earlier.
Okay. And there's more questions coming in on that. I think that we do need to move on to the next point. So we should do that and save those questions if you want for the end, because we'll have time for you to call in and ask James. Or you can write in if you don't want to call, that's fine too. But we're at about an hour and a half here, so let's go ahead and jump if you want to I know what a lot of people are bringing up that Stephen Boyce has gotten a lot of feedback for, whether it's good or bad, on his references to the number of manuscripts that contain the PA, and specifically whether those numbers that he used in the debate are accurate, or whether those numbers that are in his article are accurate. I know that he's really concerned with being represented accurately in what he's actually saying, and I think that's what we're trying to do. I know that's what you're doing in quoting him with the minute markers from the debate and quoting the article and different things like that. So I do want to be sensitive to that. because it seems like this point is the biggest point that he's getting the most flack for, and I want to make sure that we represent what he's saying accurately and address it, because obviously that's what we're examining is the evidence, the internal, external, and historical evidence for the PA, and whether or not it should be in our Bible. So where do you want to start with this conversation? And I can pull it up on the screen, whether it's the article or if we want to go to the debate. But where do you want to go first?
Well, very first, I see a question from Tommy Wasserman. Do I think that the PA was actually read at Pentecost? No, I think they skipped it, and that's what led to it being accidentally omitted by a scribe, and that led to it being omitted in the subsequent text. And that's where the whole question comes from. Now, regarding that ratio that was repeatedly used by Stephen Boyce in the debate, and that shows up toward the beginning of his online lecture that was written before the debate. The statement, I think, about 14 out of 300 uncials have the PA, tending to give the impression that over 250 don't have it. That's an impression that should not be encouraged. I'm going to from to give some idea of what we have to start with. If the Greek papyri and uncial manuscripts containing this portion of John, and again, let's stop there. That's the important uncials. That's the ones that are pertinent to this question. Uncials of Revelation, Jude, or other books that are not called John are not relevant to the question. So that number isn't 300. It goes way down. The Greek the PA is omitted in 16 witnesses up through the 10th century. Talking about Greek witnesses here. P66, P75, Aleph, B, N, T, W, X, Y, Delta, Theta, Psi, 0141, 0211, 0250. I know this is a little tedious, but bear with me. And included in manuscripts encompassing the same time frame, and then he lists those. So also he makes a note that 0250 is not a normal continuous text manuscript. Perhaps it should be considered lectionary based. So if we maximize the numbers and say we start out with 19 manuscripts omitted, 16 include, 19 omit. So that would be using the raw numbers. It wouldn't be 14 versus 286. It is more like 19 versus 16. But in that 19, you've got two manuscripts. Just a second. I wanted to illustrate this.
Here, let me get the camera back on you.
You've got two manuscripts. Codex Delta. I'll hold it up.
Try to hold it back a little bit.
I turned off the light. How's that?
That's fine, but yeah, move it towards the center a little more. Other way. Other way. Other way. Other way. Right there.
See that?
Yeah.
That's space on the manuscript. That's not the end of the text. That's the gap in John. So yeah, you could say it doesn't have it, but that's not the whole story, is it? It doesn't have it, and in a list it doesn't have it, but it has a blank space there, which means somewhere along the line that the copyist making the manuscript, even though his master copy didn't have it, somewhere in his head he had a recollection of it. So the recollection is just as old as the manuscript that he made. Also in Codex L, one of those that are listed as, the ones that don't have it, another blank space. Again, the copyist is leaving memorial space. He's not necessarily trying to configure the text exactly, but he's clearly conveying, I recall manuscripts where there was something here. Also,
let me take a second on that, because some people may be trying to follow what you're saying here, and from what I gather, the argument is, well, there's space in the text that's either left blank for a memorial, or it's a space left blank that could or could not fit the passage in there. The argument has been that even though there is a blank space that is where the PA would be, that it couldn't fit in there even if you were to try to fit it in there. And I know that you also use this particular illustration with the longer ending of Mark to show that it does fit in there and that you personally have got it to fit in there yourself. But let's talk about the significance of the blank space. You're saying that it could be for a memorial, but I don't think that you take the position that it would actually fit in there. So what exactly would the argument be for the blank space?
You'd be asking a lot of a copyist to precisely recollect the exact text of a 12-verse passage like this without having a copy handy. But and also his job at the time is not to look into the copy next door, but to replicate his master copy. But when we see this happen, the thing to see isn't that there's an exact space or an inexact space, but that there's a space, that the space is there for a reason.
Right.
And the reason is he's recollecting this other passage, the passage we don't see. That these particular, when we come to a simple count of manuscripts like we're doing here, that 19, so the 14 out of 300 comparison should be just 3, and the real number is 19 to 16. But in that 19, these two manuscripts, L and Delta, have a memorial space, so they point both ways. So you could add those to both camps, so to speak. There's an exemplar that doesn't have it, but there's also a memory that did have it in both those cases. Also in Codex Y, which I'm holding up here, Codex Y has an asterisk, it's PA next, but it has an asterisk, and to make a long story short, again, I have a blog post about this. Let me see if I can get it here.
There you go, right there.
Yeah, okay. Looking at Codex Y, it's on the list as one that doesn't have it, but it also conveys that the author, or excuse me, the copyist, is aware of a text that did have it. So again, three of those, so L, Delta, and Y, also, even though in a simple list, they're in the non-inclusion camp, but they also have definite, clear elements that say, that point in the other direction. So those could point in both directions. Also, Codex L technically is an unseal, but it's a later unseal. It's the text in unseals, but in between segments of unseal, it's got commentary, and the commentary is written in minuscule. So should a text that has the commentary in minuscule be some kind of a tiebreaker? When you can see minuscule is already in existence, they're just differentiating between text and commentary by the scripts. Also in Codex W, you have a blank page after John. William Wilcox pointed out you don't have that in other cases. So what blank page there? Did somebody think maybe we should have this blank page here to include something we haven't included? And finally, in Codex B, one of the witnesses for non-inclusion, definitely. But when you take a look at the end of John, the very end of the Gospel of John, throughout the New Testament portion of B, in the margin you have these umlauts, or distigmi. And these marks, the umlauts, tend to be thought by most people that have studied them to indicate the presence of a textual variant. Well, when you see an umlaut beside that blank space, what kind of textual variant could that be, whether it's simply a blank space? Well, we see in Family 1, that's where they put the story of the woman caught in adultery. So there's a question of the age of the umlauts. I myself think that they're later, but Dan Wallace thinks that they're ancient. At least he did back in 2008. So if these umlauts are in Beza, if these umlauts are in Codex Vaticanus, in the blank space that comes after the ending of the Gospel of Mark, why are they there if not to signify an awareness of manuscripts that had the story of the woman caught in adultery in that location? So all these points of these details about L, the blank space, Delta, the blank space, Y, the asterisk, 0250, maybe it's lectionary based, W's blank page, B's umlaut after the end of John and the blank space beside the blank space in B. These things should be in the picture too, and when they're not, they can give an impression uh, that that makes the evidence look a lot more lopsided than it actually is. So when we look at this and we say, where is the embarrassment of riches? Because at this point, we're not dealing with 300 uncials.
Yes.
We're dealing with 19
Yeah.
versus 16.
And that's
And
what I wanted to draw out, is what specifically is it that Stephen Boyce wrote in his article and what he said in the debate that you would disagree with? And where's the emphasis being placed? Because it seems like the argument is, well, the early manuscripts for the PA do not support the inclusion, when the early manuscripts against the PA would support the inclusion. And you're saying, well, one, we're using a statistic that is inaccurate, and you're given the evidence to show where the inaccuracy would be. But specifically with what Stephen Boyce said in the debate and in the article, and that would be point one, where you would disagree. And then point two would be, what is the weight of the early references for or against the PA, and what's the significance there?
Well, to start with, coming from my approach, I would just the question of making it an election where it's this many versus this many, that's not a sound approach to start with. But it seems like there's this standard that Dr. Boyce is coming from that says manuscripts must be weighed, not counted, and then in the fine print you see, unless the count is on your side. Because clearly manuscripts should be weighed. I think everybody recognizes that point.
Right.
But then once you get to a point where there is a count and it favors the text you want it to be, then that count gets brought up. It's like now we're going to tell you the count. Look in Mesker's works, and when he does this too often, where after saying we shouldn't count the manuscripts, oh, the manuscript favors us? Well, now let's count it. So there's that point to consider. But on the larger point of what did Dr. Boyce say in the debate, I can go back there and watch in his opening statement before Riddle has even presented anything, before Riddle has given him something to respond to. He has used the 14 out of 300 ratio. That's also in the opening paragraphs of his online essay on this. I think this. If you go to his website, there's a link there. City Light, something like that.
Yeah.
For the name of the church. But I think you mentioned that you have it right there with you, Josh. Right?
Yeah. Let me pull it up, and that way we can look at it here. I typed in the number 300 into the search bar, and it takes me down to his reference to the 300. This is the quotation that's getting the most kind of pushback on it. It says, by the 11th century, almost all the manuscripts were minuscule. Therefore, the most reliable manuscripts are often majuscule manuscripts due to their date. Though there are 14, those 14 are out of just under 300, period. The earliest and best versions, such as the majority of the Syriac, the Sahidic dialect of the Coptic, the Garima Gospels, and other Ethiopic witnesses, the Gothic and some Armenian, lack the PA as well. Then he references few patristic writers reference it until the 12th century. So one argument that I see first off is the reference to the earliest and best. And obviously this isn't an article, for those of you who are concerned, is not one that is published or peer-reviewed. I'm sure that would have been double-checked and somebody probably would have corrected it. I know that Stephen has admitted this is a weak point of the argument, and that's obviously where people who support the PA are going to point out the weaknesses of an argument. So what specifically are you saying is a weakness of this argument, and can you respond to the earliest and best argument?
With an awareness of the actual manuscript evidence, would say that the number 300 should not be used. That's simply a very rough estimate of the number of uncials we have. It's not an estimate of the number of uncials of John chapter 7 verse 8 that we have. And again, I think I already gave the actual proportion. It's 19 versus 16, and there are anomalies in some of the ones that don't include it that point in the other direction. That's the real. If you're going to make a ratio, that's the realistic one. The 14 out of 300 is a phantom. You might as well include copies of Hamlet as include the copies that are not Gospels copies.
Right, because it's not relevant. So, yeah.
Exactly. Smuggling in the number 300 is just something that nobody should use anymore. So I would expect that I don't think there was anything devious going on.
Right.
I think he just saw a number and say, hey, this looks like an impressive point, and went with that without a full awareness of those uncials not really having anything to do with what we're talking about.
So if you take out the number 300, the number of manuscripts that would support it versus the number of manuscripts that would not support it, what would that be?
In terms of uncials, going by we might have a variation, a teensy tiny one, in the last 5 or 6 years. But going by the numbers that I've got, which I think are pretty current, we would have 1,476 minuscules that have it,
okay.
At least part of it. 267 minuscules that don't have any part of it.
Okay.
Then when it comes to the uncials, in theory, giving the benefit of the doubt to space considerations, and that is relevant to at least 4 of these, 19 that don't have it versus 16 that do have it. But again, because in A and C and T, we don't actually have the Greek text that comes immediately before the story of the woman caught in adultery. We have to rely on space considerations. And because we have that asterisk in Y, and because we have that umlaut in B, and because we have that blank page in W, even if you want to stretch it that far, it's pretty much a tie in numerical terms. I mean, we're talking about B and X in the same tabulation. So there's a big difference in quality going on here. Yep. But in simple terms of what is the relative statistic, it's not 14 out of 300. No. It's more in terms of uncials, practically a tie.
Right.
Because some of them point both ways.
So we've got the.
You probably get away with saying 16 and 16 or 17 and 17.
Yeah.
Depending on how you interpret the ones that point both ways.
So let's say it's a tie, and we've got a tie. Then the number, if you're just putting a weight on the number of manuscripts for or against it, it's a dead even tie, depending on how you interpret some of those things. So if that's true,
yes.
But where do we place the weight as far as oldest and best? Like, why is that an argument to say it's better to leave it out? Because even though it's a tie in the number of manuscripts that support it versus those that don't support it, we're going to go with the oldest and best. Is that a good argument?
Well, what is best is part of the question of discussion, isn't it? Yeah. A manuscript that leaves out a large section of text like this, people might wonder, why should we call that the best if our conclusion is that it leaves out this big chunk of text, if it's missing this? Best is an evaluation. Oldest, however, is something else. And when it comes to the oldest, the old Latin Capitula are old. The testimony of Ambrose is old. Also, when it comes to things that are specifically called old, Jerome, in one of his compositions, early 400s, mentions that he had seen in many manuscripts. Now, this is something that somehow, who knows how, the NET's footnote about the passage doesn't mention. I don't know. Maybe I do. But anyway, Jerome specifically says he's seen many manuscripts in both Greek as well as Latin that contain this passage. And he specifies, by the way, these were manuscripts of John. He specifies that. What more could you ask for? Now, this is Jerome speaking about manuscripts that he's already got, made before that point, that he's seen. So that's something that he testifies to. He also says in his introduction to the Latin Gospels in the Vulgate, this is an earlier comment that he made earlier in his career, around the year 383, when he releases the Vulgate. He releases part of the Vulgate. He releases the Vulgate Gospels with a little preface where he points out, I used ancient Greek manuscripts as the basis for my text. I kept the the little quirks and the things that we're used to in Latin, but I wanted to use ancient Greek manuscripts. Now, how old is ancient to Jerome? The year 400? He never says. But if he's got many Greek manuscripts in this other comment, and when we mix the Vulgate, which includes the story of the woman caught in adultery, in 383, there's a basis right there if you talk about ancient testimony. Jerome's manuscripts. Yeah. Also, Augustine's no slouch when it comes to manuscripts. He had Greek manuscripts. He might not have used them a whole lot, but he definitely cited them at some points when there was something that he wanted to emphasize. And of course, Augustine uses the story of the woman caught in adultery repeatedly. And so it's like if anybody said, well, that's not on a manuscript, obviously not a lot of people are saying that to Augustine. Because Augustine's working around Carthage, and he's working mainly in Latin. But Augustine's contemporary, Faustus, Augustine happens to mention at one point that Faustus, one of the bad guys, a Manichaean, he used the detail in the story of the woman caught in adultery. Augustine mentions other people out there. These were pagans who kind of made fun of Jesus for writing on the ground. So there we see three different sources, and Augustine, his opponent, the Manichaean, and some pagans that all took for granted that the story of the woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John was right where it belonged.
Okay, so we've got 2 points that have come up in the conversation. I want to bring these up, and then maybe you and I can hit 1 or 2 more major points before we go to questions from the audience, because we're at about an hour and 50 minutes now. So let's do these first 2 comments. Tommy says, James Snap, are the manuscripts that added the passage are inferior. So, one, it seems like to me we would have to accept that there were manuscripts that added the passage, and then 2, we would have to accept that they're inferior, in opposition to what typically is the argument that, and I know you agree with this, that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus would be inferior manuscripts. So how would you address those 2 points from Tommy? That 1, it was added. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time to support that it wasn't an addition. But specifically with the inferior reference to the manuscripts that it is included in, what would your response be to that? And then I've got 1 more question from the audience, and then we'll hit 1 or 2 major points, and then go to you guys from the audience to call in or type in your questions.
Yeah, I would argue, now, remembering, when we call a manuscripts inferior, we're not talking about the manuscript itself, but the text, the transmission line. When we look at where is the inferior text, we need to look at how is that transmission line behind the text. Look at the transmission line of Sinaiticus and compare it to, say, a much later Byzantine manuscript, and compare how often did a mistake have to be introduced into the text line to end up with this text. I've made studies comparing Sinaiticus to medieval Byzantine manuscripts and other manuscripts, and consistently, Sinaiticus's transmission line does not come out of the comparison well. It looks like they made mistakes much more frequently to get to such an inaccurate text by the time Sinaiticus was made, while in the case of Byzantine manuscripts, they're not making nearly as many mistakes nearly as often. Now, if we recognize that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are both in the same transmission line, and P75 is there too, and P66 is there too, we're looking at a transmission line where there was a degree of chaos happening. We're looking at a scenario on the ground where there's Alexandrian text, or essentially Alexandrian text, but also every now and then a Western reading will just collide. So calling the Byzantine text inferior, I say, well, that's part of the question at issue. Are these all inferior texts? How do you define inferior? Is Sinaiticus inferior in Revelation? Would Tommy Wasserman say, oh yeah, Sinaiticus has a really good text in Revelation? No, it doesn't. You're saying that the Byzantine text is much better in Revelation? Well, if the Byzantine text can be better in Revelation, why does that rule out not the Alexandrian text not being so great elsewhere? But that would get into again a lot of tangential materials, a lot of logical questions.
So I think and he clarified, and obviously it's tough It's tough to follow the questions as they're coming in and try to bring them up when it's time after the conversation has progressed a bit. But Tommy says that he was making that reference to the inferior, those manuscripts being considered inferior because you had made a comment about the best manuscripts not omitting the PA. So I think that'd be more specific to what he's referring to there. But okay, so if
I could follow up just a second.
Yeah.
The idea that the manuscripts would be the scripts that were where the copyist did their job the best, and that's the kind of copyist, the one that makes a good text, that would be the kind of copyist who makes the kind of mistake that explains the omission of the story of the woman caught in adultery. The kind of copyist who is disciplined and does what he thinks he's being told to do, who sees those marks and says, I skip from here to here. He doesn't realize those marks are for the lector. He thinks those marks are for him. And so, being a disciplined scribe, the kind of scribe that ends up making a high-quality text in his manuscript, that doesn't mean the guy before him or the guy after him did, but this particular scribe does exactly what he thinks he's supposed to do, which results in the loss of the story of the woman caught in adultery.
Okay, so you had made an argument earlier with the umlauts and the PA. Ada Inez Ledesma, I may be pronouncing that wrong, but in reference to that, they say there are umlauts for the heavenly witnesses in Vaticanus. However, that can only be a conditional auxiliary evidence. I know you don't believe the heavenly witness would be authentic, but how would you respond to the umlauts being referenced to support the heavenly witness there?
That'd be a great question to ask those that believe that the umlauts are early. I think that they're later. I think that it's somebody using possibly a Latin exemplar as the point of comparison. But for those that do think that they're later, that umlaut matters quite a bit. Again, your view on the umlauts, whether they're early or late, and whether they're by the scribe of Vaticanus or a contemporary, or whether they're later or a little bit of each, in which case, who knows the significance of any particular umlaut. And by the way, I'm using the term umlaut because that's what I was used to when I was first introduced to them. But,
right.
but the technical term is distigmi. If those dots are early, it might not. When they're beside the comma, just to diverge there for just a little bit here. Those dots might refer to the transposition of verses, because in some Latin copies of 1 John. What we think of as verse 8 comes before what we think of as verse 7. That's all that those dots might be there to represent.
Could it be that if the umlauts, I'll call them that, if those are correct, that they're very early, that they would be support for the heavenly witness, if that's correct?
Would it be would it be possible to interpret those dots as evidence for the Johannine comma?
Yes.
Comma. If that is the assumption being proposed, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be. Okay. But again, we have to ask ourselves. We have dots. They're just dots.
Just dots.
Does that necessarily imply that they're made in ancient times? Because anybody can make dots in a manuscript at any time. I mean, we have manuscripts from the 400s that people have written chapter and verse numbers in the margins in. I mean, we have manuscripts from the 1200s that somebody has written something in pencil in the side. Anybody could add the dots at any time, and if they're using similar ink, it's very difficult to tell when those dots were put there.
Okay, let's hit one last major point that you would like to address. Let's do what you think is probably, see how you want to end it, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I'll give you guys the number. When you want to call in, you can call in now and wait if you want on the line to make sure you're the first caller, or you can just wait until we get there. But the number is going to be 816-866-0025. And when we open this up to you guys, I want to make sure that you understand that it doesn't have to be just about the PA or the debate or the article or riddles material or any of that stuff. James has said that if you want to ask any text critical question, he's more than willing to answer those. I know we've had some people who have messaged me on Facebook that's a reason why they would call in, is to just ask a text critical question not related to the PA. So you can do that. But give me a call if you want to get a question in. If you want to be the first one to get your question, you should call now. So anyways, James, I'll turn it back to you for the final point that you want to make for this particular review.
One point was regarding the movement of the Pericope Adulterae to different locations, which again is probably how most people are introduced to the questions about it in Bible footnotes. And we saw in the lecture, the debate, a repeated reference. I've already covered most of those movements, but it was also, why is it in Luke? And this question was, I think Stephen had said, I don't believe the lectionaries are the answer there. Well, Ben Lopik definitely says the lectionaries are the answer there. Burkett, a scholar of a previous generation, he looked into it and said, yes, the lectionaries are the answer there. Any other explanation is inconceivable. And I'm pretty sure he knows what that word means. The story of the woman caught in adultery, most of it, verses 8 through 11, is the lection for St. Pelagia's Day. This would be in the Minologion, not the main Synaxarion part of the lectionary, but we see it in the Minologion for verses 8 through 11. And we see it moved there, not just in the later Greek manuscripts, but in the Palestinian Aramaic. There's readings in it that show that this had clearly happened by the time of the Palestinian Aramaic, not just where Chris Keith puts it later on in the 800s or 900s. The day in the Minologion for Sergius and Bacchus was October 7th. That's the day of the year where they would celebrate that day. And the reading for Sergius and Bacchus was in Luke 21, 12 through 19. Pretty much the next opportunity to put the reading for the next day, October the 8th, would be right here where we find it in the F13 manuscripts. The day for Pelagia is October the 8th, after the day for Sergius and Bacchus, and that's where we see it there in Luke at that particular place. So all the places where it's been transplanted to have explanations, and they all get traced back to, yeah, we saw it here in John, and then we moved it. The original place where they saw it in John, the 86th section, which is, to our way of thinking, after John chapter 7, verse 52. There are a couple of things that Jeff Dribble had mentioned that probably need to be clarified too. It's not just a one-way street. The claim that the Sahidic version or the Coptic versions include it, I would say that's wrong. You'd have to look very, very late in the Coptic tradition to find the PA. They have it in some sculptures maybe, but in the actual manuscripts, the early ones, it's not there. Also, there was a reference to Origen. I think this was a point that was in one of Tommy's books. I think if you look at that, you will have to squint awfully hard to say that's not something that can be explained another way. To say that has to be a reference to the PA there in the works of Origen, and the same way in Cyril, I think this was a point that was probably overemphasized by Riddle because Alan Brent made a claim for it so confidently. I would say no. There are other explanations. Now, that idea that Origen has this illusion, or that Cyprian makes this illusion, I wouldn't put any weight on that. So.
Okay, so thank you for that, James. I think we've got our first caller here, and then we've got another question that's come in. So we'll go to the caller first. If you could, let me turn the volume up on this so we can hear you. Just state your name and go ahead with your question.
Stephen from Dutchess County, New York. A very nice discussion, spirited. Thank you, James. Thank you, Joshua. My question is this. Isn't there a hidden envelope under the textual criticism position with all the discussions of lectionaries and Capelians and this or that? And isn't it all come down to Vaticanus? They don't really care whether it's 6 or 15 magistrates. If Vaticanus was the opposite way, supporting the Pericope Adulterae. I'll give the English. Isn't it absolutely clear that there never would have been a Westcott-Hort or critical text support of this being omitted if Vaticanus had in fact had the section? Because that text is essentially a Vaticanus primacy text. Thank you.
That's a good question. Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
All right. How do you want to answer that, James? If it was in Vaticanus, would it be
if the spread of content adultery was in Vaticanus, would it be accepted? Probably more readily, but there would still be the pushback that you get from the papyri. When Westcott and Hort wrote, they didn't have the P66 and P75. They didn't even have Codex Y. They didn't have the Synodic Syriac. And yet, the text that you see in your typical base text of your typical ESV or NIV or etc., is essentially the Westcott-Hort text. The differences are about 650, leaving up in the air the places where the text is bracketed. That's the extent of the differences.
Okay.
Vaticanus played a key role for Westcott and Hort's model, the transmission model. And before Westcott and Hort, Granville Penn made the same kind of model of transmission, exalting Vaticanus as the text for all intents and purposes, except again when the copyist made some horrible and indefensible mistake. So yeah, if Sinaiticus and Vaticanus both had the PA, I'm fairly confident that people would say, all right, there are some that don't. Wow, there's a big mystery here that we can't explain. But because we have these two old manuscripts that we really like, and because we can make a case that the other manuscripts, now this was a case that Hort can make at the time, I'm not saying it can be validly made now, but because we have these two manuscripts that we like a lot, and the only other option is the Western, which we all don't like, we're going to go with it. And so that's probably a point that can be granted, that, of course, anybody can say if, because
right.
That's what happened is what happened.
Awesome. Okay, thank you for that, Stephen, and thank you for your response there, James. We've got another question that came in from Lucas Pagado Tanusi. I hope I said that right. Lucas, forgive me if I didn't, but you say, do you think that the content in the PA is quite similar to the same language / line of thought in the rest of John? If
you look at the Jeff Ribble did a pretty good job of demolishing the internal evidence, right up to the point, I think, where he had his opponent say that, yeah, these vocabulary-based arguments really don't matter very much. These are not essential arguments. And one thing that we can look at in Stephen Boyce's case is sometimes he referred to the exact forms. If you get to an actual Greek New Testament that you can search through and search for those exact forms, you won't see it there as many times as he indicates that it's there in that exact form. And once you've given up that exact form aspect of the argument, there's really not much to it. There's a claim that Matthew and Mark and Luke use this throughout their Gospels. Well, when you actually take the time to look through their Gospels for those exact terms, it's not throughout their Gospels. It's just, if it's there at all, it's only there a couple of times. So I would just say, watch the debate, watch how Jeff Riddle dismantles that, and watch how Dr. Boyce ends up saying, yeah, this isn't really what I'm building my case on.
Okay, we've got another question. Hey, by the way, Robert, I would love to have you call in, man. If you're comfortable doing that. I know you're trying to figure out the interface. Okay, so let's see. And I know what your position is, and that's fine. We could still get your question in. But we've got another question from Gary Whitehouse. Gary says, Josh and James Snap, I am looking at Alan O'Reilly's book called O Biblios, the book, and he cites in his book on page 74 that Fuller and Bergen, that out of the 73 copies of the Gospel is in the British Museum, which contain John 7:53 through 8:11. So it's a comment, not a question, but how would you support that?
Yeah, I have no doubt that that's not true. I would say that is probably the case, that Virgin could look into the British Library at that point, which would be back in the 1870s probably, and confirm, yes, he has indeed found this passage in these Bibles, or these manuscripts. But you can look in how many times have you given this statistic? I still can't find it. You can look in 1,000, much more than 73. Look in 1,476 manuscripts from various places, not just at the British Library, but all over the place, and you'll see the story of the woman caught in adultery. So that might give you some idea of how far the field has gone in terms of compilation of evidence from the days of Bergen and the days of Westcott and Hort, but how little we've come from the text of Westcott and Hort.
Okay, now this is kind of going to be a little bit different kind of question, all right? So this particular question is going to come from a Roman Catholic perspective. The Roman Catholic perspective is asking, who in the world has the authority to decide this kind of question for folks? Is it you? Is it me? What's the authority that we have to decide what should or shouldn't be in the Bible? Because the Catholic has the Roman Catholic Church to be able to tell them what is and what isn't canon. So how would you respond to that?
Well, if one would assume a standard Roman Catholic perspective, and again I emphasize with that in the premises granted, if one would take that perspective, then you could say that when you look at the Council of Trent's decrees, the Vulgate is the canonically authoritative text. So the templates of the text that's in the Vulgate would be the standard for what is the authoritative text. Whether or not somebody comes up later on and says, I don't think the book of Daniel really belongs in there. I think it's completely apocryphal. Or, I think this chapter in Jeremiah doesn't belong there. Generally, the Catholic standard has been, since the Council of Trent, that the Vulgate sets the standard. Now, asking what is the Vulgate, you have to do a little bit of digging, because not all Vulgate copies are the same. But definitely the story of the woman caught in adultery is in there. It's definitely used by Jerome himself. It's definitely in the official Vulgate. It's in the Vulgate as issued by Jerome. So for Roman Catholics, it would be a superfluous question what the textual critics say, because textual critics say all kinds of things about various kinds of forms of the text. The church magisterium in Roman Catholicism has already decreed that this text is part of the authoritative text of the church.
Well, and let me follow up on that real quick. This isn't a question that came in from the audience, but when did the Roman Catholic Church actually decree what is and isn't canon? And what happened up to that point with canon?
There was generally a default consensus before the Council of Trent. At the Council of Trent, they made that promulgation. And if you look at the details of that promulgation, you'll see the details of exactly what they were talking about with this question and the Gospel of Mark, both in the picture.
I see. Okay, I know. So Robert says he's going to call in. I'll wait for that call, but while I'm waiting for him to call, we've got another question that came in online. This is from Leslie Coomer, and it's more of a comment, but I want your response. Leslie says, it is found in some manuscripts of Luke. It sounds like Luke, according to some New Testament scholars. It is an agrapha, an authentic story of Jesus that was penned outside the text of the Gospels. It was saved for us in John. It is ancient, is used enough in ancient texts, and can be treated as an authentic story of Jesus, but the Gospel of Jesus does not hang on it. How would you respond to that?
Is there a question in there somewhere? Because I've already addressed the what we see at the end of Luke 21. That's because of the election cycle that was in the Menologion. Follows the reading for Sergius. Again, Van Lopik goes into this. Chris Keith addresses it. Why it is still a question, I think, is simply because people want to go on giving people the impression it was a floating anecdote, when once you look at it in detail, you'll see that it wasn't. I see a position there, but I don't see a question.
Yeah, there's not much of a question there. But let's see. I'm trying to go through these because it's.
I've addressed some of that already.
Yeah. But you don't. You would obviously say that it's not Luke that's the author, as some people would say that it is, and it was brought into John.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Let's. This might be a good opportunity to take a picture. What is the? Oh, it was from Luke's source materials. What model of history of the text is being painted there? That Luke had a story, that somewhere else there was another story, that neither one is the text in John, but somebody took this story and put them together, and somebody else gave it a little preface about everybody going home, because who starts the story with everybody went home? And then somebody had to decide, let's not leave this as a story outside the Gospels like we do with the story of Abgar, but let's put it in the Gospel of John. And let's put it in there right at this part where we celebrate Pentecost, right in the middle, where nothing naturally calls for, nothing says, yeah, this is where it should go. Frankly, that simply seems implausible, and I think most people that consider that would say, yeah, that doesn't make sense, that all these things would have to happen. It is a proposal that multiplies entities superfluously. It doesn't survive Occam's razor, to put it another way.
That's good. Okay, well, I think that I know we were waiting on Robert is calling in right now, so give me just a second, guys, and I'm going to get him on the line with us. Hey, are you there?
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, if you wanted to, just state who you are, and and I know that this is Robert, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So if you wanted to, you can. I mean, feel free if you wanted to give a brief summary of what your position is, and then give your question, or if you just want to give your question, that's totally fine too.
Yeah, it's. I'm watching the stream here, seeing what's live and what's private. So, okay, so I'm on here now, right?
Yep, yeah, you're live on here.
Okay, so I'm Robert Trulove. I'm the pastor of Christ Reformed Church here in Lawrenceville, Georgia, which is a suburb of Atlanta. And I advocate what I refer to as the canonical argument for the text of Scripture, which advocates the received text of the Reformation era. And there's a lot of overlap as far as readings that James Snapp and myself would agree to. But Snapp's position is principally, well, it's an empirical position, whereas mine is a theological position as it's based upon the argument of canon. So, what question would I be asking? I don't know that I have a question per se, but people were interested in my take on this.
Yeah.
And it's so we're trying to get my thoughts together. Let me turn off my computer so I hear myself on my computer. So I appreciate the kinds of argumentation that Dr. Snapp, he has his honorary doctorate, what Dr. Snapp brings to the table. Empirical arguments for a canonical approach to this are not irrelevant, but we would say they're secondary. So primarily we're interested in the doctrine of Scripture and canon as we see it in the history of Christianity as God has authenticated the Scripture to the church. So the canonical argument for the text leads us to the advocacy of the received text. That does not mean that we deny the validity of arguments like Dr. Snapp is bringing to our attention today, that the empirical arguments are completely irrelevant. We would just simply say that they are secondary in nature. So,
no,
I can hear. So in light of that, it's interfacing the canonical argument with what Dr. Snapp is saying here today is sort of like, from where I'm standing, it's like interfacing younger creationism with creation scientists. So, looking at what people say regarding empirical evidence regarding creation and six-day creation
and these kinds of things, recognizing that science can change, the arguments can change. We can see that, what looks like a good argument today could be a bad argument tomorrow, and we're fine with that because principally our view is based upon the teaching of Scripture, not the empirical evidence as it stands today for, various views of creation. And so the canonical argument for the text looks at this the same way. So, we're open to the strong empirical evidence for the readings of what we would call the canonical text, and at the same time open to men like Tommy Wasserman. If he's saying an argument really isn't a good argument, then we're not. Our position isn't dependent upon empiricism, so we can modify the empirical arguments as necessary. But to get at the root of the issue, the question is, what is canon?
Yeah.
What is canonical? What has God authenticated to the hearts of His people in the history of Christianity? And we see a sort of apex of that happened specifically at the time of the Reformation, and we're sort of like all parties threw down on what they regarded as canon, not just Protestants, but Catholics as well. And that's why I sort of hesitate to call into this, because this is a whole different ball of wax than what my brother James Snap is bringing forward as far as empirical arguments. But it's not that we just completely deny the relevancy of those empirical arguments.
See, and I think that's why it's important to have these conversations, because we've got three different positions that are represented. Tommy Wasserman has got the critical text, and that's going to be a reconstructive methodology, but with reasoned eclecticism. And then James Snap is equitable eclecticism, but has a completely different text platform. And then you and I have a TR position. It's a completely different Greek text. And I like the term the canonical text, and I like the way that we arrive at what is the canonical text, because some people try to divorce the text from the canon and say you can't say the canonical text is the text of the canon. But we would take the position, and specifically Robert Truelove takes the position that the text makes the canon. So that's where the argument would lie, and I would relate to that a lot.
And historically, praised the canon and all of its parts. So this idea that canon just respects the books, that's really a modern idea. Historically, you will find a number of writers before the modern era referring to the canon and all of its parts. And, the question being, what do they mean by all of its parts? Well, the parts is everything that pertains to the canon, including the text.
Yeah. Okay, James, let's get your take on that. And Robert, I don't know if you want to interact at all, but I appreciate you. I appreciate you calling in. So, all right, James, what's your take on that?
Well, what Robert seems to be describing is an ecclesiastical bibliological position, in which you look at the history of the church and say, what has been the text used by the church? When you take that approach, you have to ask then, which church? Because the church here in America has a predominantly Anglican history as far as the shape of the Bible in English goes. Look at the Byzantine church throughout the Middle Ages, and you'll see a church that uses a text similar to the TR, but which is different at many points, over 1,000 translatable points. The Byzantine text, the majority text that you'll see, say, by Maurice Robinson and Pierpont, is different from the TR. The TR has many minority readings, which don't look like they are the text that was used throughout history. The Westminster Confession uses several phrases besides the word pure, which can be explored and mapped out, but also uses the phrase, the text used in every stage of church history, which to that effect. And when we look at church history, we don't see a lot of the readings that are in the TR. We have to basically start in the 1500s and say zoom in on that, what text they were using. When printing of the Bible started, and focus on that, and make that our standard. That's what we see leading up to the Westminster Confession. That's what's adopted there. When we see take a larger picture, and you'll see different texts being used in different locales. There are texts that are used in Byzantium, where we have readings that aren't used in the church in Egypt, that are not used in the church in Syria, that are not used in the church in other parts of Europe, that are not used in the church in Africa, North Africa. I mean, not the whole continent, the province of Africa. And so, to appeal to the text of the church, that's fine if the world starts with the printing press, but back up a bit to the early church, and you have to at some point say which text. If you just arbitrarily say, "Oh, we like the text in Egypt," you'll end up with a text very much like the Nestle Island. If you say, well, we like the text that Jerome had with his old manuscripts, you'll end up with a text like the Vulgate. If you try to look at the church as a whole and weigh and balance the evidence point by point, things will get a lot more complicated. There's a lot more text critical work to do, which is all very simplified, even though there's the danger of getting the wrong answer by simply saying, let's decree what the text is. That's what happened at the Council of Trent. Indirectly, you could say that there is a default setting in orthodoxy to say, well, look at the history of how the text has been used. Do we see the story of the woman caught in adultery in the lectionary? We don't see it in the Pentecost lectionary reading, the Pentecost lectionary, I should say. But we see it in the Minologion on St. Pelagia's Day. So clearly it's there in the text. It's used in the Minologion, which gives it a default authoritative status. Because we can see that in the, even though the 1904, 1912 editions are not particularly old, and the basis is not particularly good, that is an official publication in which we see this passage. So a lot of it depends on when you start saying, let's decide by decree. What was decreed in the Westminster Confession? First, you have to say, what were they really saying? Did they really mean all textual discussion is over? We can just go with what we've got? Or was it more complicated? Look at what they did, and it looks like they naturally assumed it's more complicated.
So let me try to summarize this, and then Robert, I want to give it back to you to see if you wanted to respond to that. But it seems like to me, James, what you're saying is we've got a text today that would represent the African text that they had then. We've got a text today that would represent the Western text that they had back then. We've got a text today that would represent the Eastern text that they had back then. And you're making an argument, well, who's to say that what they did in the Reformation should be authoritative to deciding what the text we should have today in the West, in America, when that's not what historically has been circulated throughout the known world. And obviously, Robert, it seems like you're placing a lot of emphasis on what God was doing in the Reformation to say this is the Reformation text that God used, that God has really kind of lit the world on fire for the last 400 years with, and the translations that have come from it. And that's where we should place our emphasis. And the work is done. It has been done. We just receive it. But how would you respond to kind of James' take there? Because obviously he's got a more of an empirical approach, but every one of us has got some element of faith going, this is what God is doing, and this is what we've got to do in receiving it and using it and bringing it to the world.
Right. So what I point out is, I mean, oftentimes people will say to me that, Robert, you're just arbitrary in identifying this text of the Reformation. Why not the text of the 12th century or the 8th century or the 5th century? Why not those texts? Now, this assumes that you can identify monolithically what was the text of the 8th century. We only have the extant witnesses of that, right? So, I mean, we don't have, the printing press hadn't been invented yet, so we don't have a text in print that is monolithic, if you will. So why the Reformation text? Is it just because printing was invented then and we could come to one definitive text or close to that? Is it arbitrary? Well, what people fail to realize in the history of canon was canon had fuzzy edges throughout the history of much of the first 1,500 years of Christianity. You had the Homologomena, which were the books that everyone agreed about that was canon, like the Gospels, for instance, and Romans, and many of the Pauline epistles. But we have these troubling little books called the Antilegomena. And the Antilegomena were questioned in Christian history up until the time of the Reformation, so much so that certain books, the Antilegomena is disputed books, disputed words. In Luther's German Bible, when the German Bible first comes into print, now we're talking about a Protestant now, the proto-Protestant or the first Protestant, you have in Luther's German Bible, the preface to St. James and St. Jude call those books into question, as well as the preface to Revelation. So we have like Luther's Antilegomena, where Luther's not coming completely out of left field, denying the canonicity of these books. These were Antilegomena. They were questioned before Luther. Now, early on in the Reformation, these things were decided, but the question of the scope of the canon in regards to, big picture, what is the canon? Where are the books that belong in the Bible? These things were finally and definitively decided at the time of the Protestant Reformation. It was not until the Council of Trent that Rome threw down on Rome's council. That was the first ecumenical council that did that for the Roman Catholic Church, and they accept the Apocrypha, for example. The Protestants, on the other hand, they threw down and denied the Apocrypha, and they accepted, the books of our Old and New Testament scriptures as canonical. Now, it wasn't like no one had accepted them before. It had been, but you had these books that you had disputes over it. So these things, as a matter of fact, happened at the time of the Protestant Reformation, and at the same time when this happened, you had this common received text, the common text, they referred to it as, coming to the forefront that the Protestants and the post-Reformation scholastics saw as canonical. They viewed their text as canonical. And so when we look back from the 21st century at that, we say there was a very distinct, specific development in the history of the canon where God brought all of these things to a head at that time period, and therefore we receive the received text as received, as canon. So see, that's theological. It's not empirical. It's a theological argument, and it's based on the Scripture's doctrine of Scripture. But that doesn't mean that we would take the various arguments that James Snapp and others would make and say empiricism has absolutely no place in this. No, we would say it's secondary.
Yeah. Hey, James, let's get your response on that, and then we can see if there's anything that, Robert, you want to respond back to, and then we can wrap it up and close out from there.
I'm hearing a case being offered for ecclesiastical bibliology. That's not this discussion. This discussion is about the story of a woman caught in adultery. Maybe there's an overlap there, but...
Well, yeah, I wanted Robert... So, with the question and answer, I wanted it to be open to any text-critical question, not just the PA.
Question.
Well, it's not a question. Obviously, Robert's giving his perspective there, but I wanted to see if you had a response to that or not.
Yes, the Textus Receptus of the 1500s and 1600s, what was being used at the Westminster Confession of Faith by those guys, contains many minority readings. It's very similar to the Byzantine text, but it has about 1,000 or so readings in it that are not the text traditionally used by the church. If a person wants to appeal to authority, appeal to an authority that exists before the Reformation. Why start the world in the 1500s? I think that a lot of that is because that's where our printed text comes. That's based on our favorite translation, the King James Bible. So there seems to be that's part of the impetus. I think that if you would ask most folks that try to use that approach, that just happens to be one of the side effects of the position that the King James Version is always right. because it has a text that's always right. And the reason why the text is always right, because of manuscripts? No. Because of early patristic evidence? No. When it comes down to it, at those points where there's a minority reading, what is the standard being used by the ecclesiastical bibliologist? The decree. It's like we have our very own Council of Trent in the Westminster Confession. We just don't call it a Council of Trent. It's the Westminster Confession. And therefore we don't need to study the manuscripts because we have our canonical text. Well, first, I don't think that's what they were saying when they made that statement. I think they were saying pure in the sense of this is the message that is being transmitted is pure. We can find the gospel in this text. We find everything we need to know about Jesus in this text, as far as a text can tell us about Jesus. We see this text as being a standard that we have, a standard of measurement. But those guys weren't saying, let's look into Ephesians 3:9 and make a decision about Ephesians 3:9, which reading it should be. They weren't making a decision about, well, Luke 7:31 should have this opening phrase in there, this incipit. That was not on the radar. The textual issues that, like the one we're looking at today, continue to be discussed within the church. Guys came up later on, and nobody shouted them down to say, Mr. Bengal, how dare you say such a thing? Mr. Trudels, you heretic. How dare you question the text? We have a standard. Nobody was doing that. Usher, who was mentioned earlier, nobody was appealing to Usher, making a response to Usher that said, but Mr. Usher, the church has spoken, the question is closed. When it comes to the details of readings, the question is clearly still open and remained open on this kind of issue, the minority readings in the TR. Those questions remained open until somebody in the past 100 years said, you know what, I think we should reinterpret the Westminster Confession to mean that what they meant was every reading is settled, except for where the actual printed copy of TR disagree. Our standard is not in manuscripts, it's not in patristic evidence, it doesn't go back before the printing press. Take the printing press out of the equation, and there can be no ecclesiastical bibliology as it's being promoted today.
Well, and I'll give my take on that because I'm not Reformed. I'm not a confessional text guy, but I'm a TR guy, and I like the term the canonical text as opposed to confessional text because I'm not Reformed, and I believe that from my perspective that the TR is the correct text. One, because of the value of the Reformation, but two, because of the internal, external, and historical ecclesiastical support for it. I think it's something that God used in the Reformation period when we were making a declaration on what launched the Reformation in the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And that's the text that God used. And I'm not a Calvinist. I do videos against Calvinism all the time. But I believe in the canonical text. I believe, and I'm not calling anybody a heretic who rejects it. Who I would call a heretic is somebody who rejects justification by faith alone, in the finished work of Christ alone. But that's my take. Robert, let's do it quick. If you want to respond, you're more than welcome to. And then James, I'll give you the last word, and we'll wrap it up from there.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate James' comments. And, I appreciate a lot of the work that James has done regarding the text and his argumentation and such. But, we kind of went through this here regarding where my position would differ on this. But I just want to note that in regards to his response to me, I did not mention the Westminster Confession of Faith or the London Baptist Confession or any Reformed confessional commitment, though I am a confessional Reformed Baptist. And before that, I was a confessional Presbyterian. So, I have a deep history in confessional Reformdom. But that wasn't my argument. So the confession say it, so this is what it is. My argument wasn't based on the printing press per se, monolithic text and printing and what have you. Just basically every criticism he had towards what I said was not based on the actual argument that I'm bringing forward. It didn't acknowledge the antilegomena issue. The issue that we did have fuzzy edges of the canon that regardless of what position you take on this textual issue, it's historical fact that the canon was not firmly settled as it is now at the time preceding the Reformation, at the times preceding. We had questions, and that would lead Luther to denying many books today that we wouldn't allow many people to join our churches if they rejected books of Scripture. That in his first German translation that he, called into question. So I think that one of the difficulties that I have is in trying to communicate the position that I'm espousing is that people bring in baggage, like the King James translation was mentioned. I didn't once make a reference to the King James translation. I'm talking about the Greek and Hebrew received text. But it makes the matter, it basically allows people to throw a lot of mud and dirt up into the air without actually looking at the actual argument itself. If I was arguing for the King James Bible, then I'll be arguing for the King James Bible. I'm not. I love the King James Bible. I think it's great. I'm a literary nerd, and really like the style of it. But I've openly said on a number of occasions that, New King James, MEV, these are TR translations, and every translation you have to check by its source, right? So my thing, just kind of in passing here, is that I don't think to date that anyone has really solidly engaged with the actual argument that I'm making, and I think the argument that I'm making is an inherent argument that we see in the Reformation and post-Reformation era. If they didn't use my exact same terms, the ideas that I'm presenting are things that we see that are prolifically written about during that time period. And that was the time period when we came back to sola scriptura, where the Bible is the authority. It's not the magisterium of the church. It's not ecclesiastical authority. It's the Scripture and Scripture alone that is the authority to which we should look to for all matters pertaining to faith and practice.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for calling in, Robert. I'm going to turn it over to you, James, for the last word, and I'll catch up with you later, hopefully. So thanks again for calling in.
Okay. I'm going to hang up. See you.
All right. Bye.
Okay. All right. Back to what should be the subject at hand, the Pericope Adulterae. To sum up, I think it's a credible theory that when we have this passage where we see it in John, where we see it being affirmed in the Old Latin in the 3rd century, if the Old Latin capitula are that old, when we see it being used by Ambrose by name, when we see it being used by name by Augustine, when we see it used by name, another thing to consider is that this is a unique passage. This is not a passage that is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Because it is just found in John, there would be no impetus, no reason for an author to naturally say, oh, I'm referring to the passage in John, because everybody he's talking to would naturally assume that's where it is. There's no alternative place that he would be talking to using a text for a sermon. That's one point that should be made about one of Dr. Boyce's points in the debate when he said, oh, we seldom see it. And later on he says, in many of the cases where we see it, well, which is it, Doctor? Is it seldom or is it many? And we see these references in Jerome, because once Jerome and Augustine said something, the point was very seldom debated later on in the church in subsequent centuries. So when everybody knew what Jerome had said, and when everybody knew what Augustine said, there would be no reason to specify later on where they had found it, because in the Vulgate, obviously it's in John. In 1,476 manuscripts, we see it. But while we're on tangents like we just were, at one point Dr. Boyce made a swipe at the longer ending of Mark, saying the long ending of Mark, there was a theory that, there was room for it. Well, that theory has been disproven by size and font and usage, and it actually will overlap. I would like to get this into the discussion, even though it's not the main subject.
Yeah.
This is a picture of a reconstruction of the text of Mark 16, 9 through 20. Here it is without verses 9 through 20, the way the manuscript is. Here it is with verses 9 through 20, which I've reconstructed by cutting and pasting the letters from elsewhere on the same page. You can go online to my blog and you'll see this same picture so you can see it up close. You can't really see it very well in detail here. But just go online and look at it, and you can see that a copyist who knew how to compact his text like they did in Luke chapter 1, a copyist who knew how to compact his text could easily reproduce these 12 verses beginning where Mark 16:8 left off. There is no question about it. So please keep continuing to make the claim that that theory has been disproven. It clearly has not been. The evidence is right there in front of you on the internet. Check it out anytime. Are there any other questions?
No, I think that's good. I think that'll be a wrap as far as being able to review the debate that took place. Let me see if I can get myself so you're not just listening to me. But anyways, no, that's good, man. Hey, I really do appreciate you coming on. I know that that wasn't exactly with Robert calling in. I wanted to be able to kind of toss around the ideas there because we're in the overall scope of the conversation of text criticism. I think the methodologies and how we get to where we get with the text that we've got and how we accept and receive and the text and all of those sides of the conversation could be relevant, even though we're focused primarily on the PA. So, but anyways, yeah.
If a person says, well, let's just decree a text, then you can have it in there and no need to worry about the evidence. But if you're not going to just decree a text, you need to look into the evidence. And we see in the evidence a mechanism that easily accounts for the accidental loss of this passage. We can see how it would naturally flow from that point in Egypt to influence other text lines, letter text lines, like what we see in the Peshitta, where people would say, okay, well, I guess it's not there. We have this question about it. Once there was a question about it, other factors could be involved that would make people tend to hedge away from it. Yep. Augustine, he has a theory about it, which I go into my book on the subject. And by the way, my book's online. You can get a free copy of it from me, 99 cents at Amazon, where I cover some of the things I've reviewed here in detail. And it's 99 cents. Or, again, contact me. I'm going to give you a copy for free. But we see this factor where people had a hesitancy to accept back people who had been under pressure during persecution, and they had lapsed. They'd offered incense to the emperor. Later on, they say, please let me back into the church. Well, the nice, merciful people would say, I understand. Anybody can make a mistake. Come on back. Other people, though, would say, no, you've made a terrible mistake. We might forgive you after you're dead, but no, we're not letting you back. The response to the lapse during times of persecution could have had an effect on later opinions on how soft should we be on people who are sorry for the things they've done.
Okay. Hey, awesome. I appreciate that response. We've got. Hey, go ahead, James.
In Catholicism, again, back to the point of just deciding it by decree, it would have to almost be an automatic decision by the Council of Trent to include the Pericope Adulterae, because we see Gregory, the Great. He was called the Great for a reason, because he was very important. He's leading the church, and he used the Pericope Adulterae as scripture. We see Peter Chrysologus using it as scripture, and these are not people just. I have a story from somewhere. Maybe you've heard of it. Let me expound it for you. He's not doing that.
Yeah.
So the popes were already using it as scripture. So there's no question which way the Council of Trent was going to go. Yeah. Just like when you have the TR with all based on manuscripts that have it, there's no question about which way the leaders in the Reformation were going to go, because that's the text handed down to them.
Well, I think it's a little different than that. But okay, so we've got. Let's see if you want to do this. We've got one more call that has come in. And this is Dr. Jeff Riddle. We're doing a review of your debate. And you just called me and said that you wanted to chime in. You heard something that you wanted to make a comment on and get a question in. So if you could, Dr. Riddle, you've got the floor.
Hey, John, thanks for taking my call. James Snap, thank you for
your review. I just caught the very end of this, so I'll have to look at the previous parts later. And so I caught just the last, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 minutes of it. But, you know, I caught the part where James was saying that he thought that I demolished Stephen Boyce's arguments on the internal evidence that the Pericope Adulterae is authentically Johannine. And I will say that was the thrust of my sort of approach. You notice I spent, you know, most of my time talking about that. And I did not spend as much time discussing the external evidence. And I can say, as Robert Truelove said earlier, I really appreciate James Knapp's work on this and digging in. And I'll profit. I want to go back and review just so that I can be better equipped if I discuss this again. I'm not sure if you guys talked about earlier about Stephen's claim on Alexandrinus and the things I pointed out with regard to that. But anyways, however, James, with respect, I think, again, there is some, when you're focusing so much on the external evidence, you know, there can be some myopia with regard to other views, other reasons to embrace the Pericope Adulterae. And I know you make arguments for the internal evidence also. I think it's overwhelming. I mean, when I just preparing for this debate, looking through it again, and I didn't get a chance to put forward a lot more arguments, not just about the internal evidence, the language and so forth, but also about the narrative structure. I just think the Pericope Adulterae fits hand in glove with John 7 and 8. But you know, I think the theological aspects. You know, there was a woman who called earlier who was asking, "Isn't this, could it have been by Luke, and couldn't this have been a true story?" And I hit Stephen on this. We didn't really get much discussion that happened through it, but this whole idea of the possibility of their truth.
I have to step away for just a minute. Keep going.
All right, sorry, James.
That it somehow been...
James has got to step away for a second, Jeff.
Oh, sorry. Should I keep going, or are you going to stop?
I don't. I'd say keep going.
Okay, I'm gonna just to make a couple more statements. So, you know, just to respond to that person in particular. First of all, the material in the Pericope Adulterae is not Lucan. I mean, study that, read the Greek. There aren't Lucanisms found all throughout it. It's far-fetched. I think I demonstrated that with the evidence that I gave. In fact, there are many places where there are words and there are usages that are distinctively Johannine and in particular are not Lucan. So it's just not Lucan. You know, the whole idea that Stephen Boyce puts forward that the Pericope Adulterae was in the L source, and then it was in Proto-Luke, and then that plus an account in the Gospel of the Hebrews and in something Didymus said, as James Knapp rightly pointed out, it's just so far-fetched. I mean, aside from the fact that in the 21st century, the whole four-source theory for describing and the development of the Gospels has become passé. People don't talk about the L source anymore and so forth. I don't think so, as widely as they did in the 19th and the 20th, early 20th centuries. So there are a lot of things in Stephen's writings that I think could have profited from some review and some correction. But I was going to point out as well that James Knapp had said, well, you know, if you go back to the Protestant era, you know, they didn't have this idea that has been presented by people in the TR camp that, you know, that the scriptures were stable, and or as, you know, Robert Truelove would say, you know, that we've got the canonical text, and I agree with him on that. I think it was not just the establishment of the books, but also the text. But I would encourage James Knapp or anyone who's wondering about what the mindset and the theology was of men of that era, the framers of the Confession and those who came after, to read William Whitaker, who influenced the framers of Westminster Confession, and then in the post Westminster era, read the two articles on Scripture by John Owen in volume 16 of his collected works. And his attitude was not, hey, it's an open question, the Scriptures might mean this, they might read this, they might read that. That was not the idea. And so I would encourage you to read John Owen. And I think maybe the best evidence for that is, once there was a consensus on the Textus Receptus in the Reformation and in the post-Reformation era, and it becomes the basis not just for the translation of the King James. In fact, the King James took a long time. Let's go back to William Tyndale. Let's go to the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Matthew's Bible, the Viva Bible, and let's get to the King James. But once there's an acknowledged consensus on what the text of Scripture is, they didn't keep tinkering with it. They didn't come out with a new edition that was slightly different and then demand there be a whole rash of new translations based on it. And they simply didn't have, I think, the open, loosey-goosey view that James Snap indicated that they might have had when he referred to Usher and others. So I think John Owen is a better measure for how men of that period. We don't have that idea of.
We're getting into a different subject entirely.
We get back to the 19th century and the Enlightenment and so forth. So anyways, I probably said too much. But
No.
Anyways, listening, I wanted to chime in for just a second. I do appreciate the parts that I heard, and I'm not sure what you guys discussed earlier. But the reason I didn't focus as much on the external evidence is I didn't do as much study in that. Didn't feel like I had as much expertise in it. I put most of my effort and interest in the internal evidence and thinking about the theological evidence as well. But I do think that one of my theses is that we really can't determine things just based on weighing external evidence alone. There's not enough of it. There's not enough empirical evidence, enough external evidence, and this is why we'll never reach a consensus based on the simply our multiple evaluations of external evidence. It's already proven that we cannot come on it just on the basis of, and I commend James Snap, somebody who hasn't gone to do a PhD in text criticism, but is more knowledgeable about it than many people who have, and is one of the most knowledgeable pastors with respect to the external evidence. But I don't think that in the end that all that study of all the external evidence and having all this knowledge of manuscripts and lectionaries and so forth will gain a consensus as to what the text of Scripture is.
Yeah.
And so that's why there have to be other things, and that's the internal evidence. It's also theology, as Robert Trullo pointed out. It's the reception by God's people, and we would say from a Reformed perspective, it is that Scripture is auto pistos. It is self-authenticated because it is theopneustos. It is God-breathed, and that's why to the Catholic person who asked, no, we're not looking to the church magisterium to establish what is the text. We believe that the text is self-authenticating. The Pericope Adulterae commends itself as Scripture, and therefore it is tenacious, and it will not be removed from the Scriptures if it is the Word of God.
Yeah, that's good. Hey, I'm going to a couple of things here, and then I'll turn it over to you, to James, to wrap it up, and we'll close out from there. But Stephen, I've got to figure out how to get the technology to get the calls to come in through the pewter. So I'll work on that and try to make that a little more organized. But anyways, Jeff, thanks for calling in. I know typically when people do debate reviews, it's supposed to be without your knowledge, and we're allowed to say anything we want about you without any repercussion. But I'm just kidding. So thanks for calling in, man. That's a good take. I'm with you on that, man. It's a huge difference.
I only heard the last, maybe it was a half hour of it. Sorry, but I listened in. I probably should just kept quiet and kept my thoughts to myself.
No, you're good. I'm glad you called in. And by the way, when we do a review on Monday with Stephen Boyce and Jonathan Sheffield, you should call into that too. I'm just kidding. So, but anyways, yeah, thanks for calling in, James. I'm going to turn it back to you. Thanks for being patient. I know we're getting away from the PA discussion, but I think that in an overall scope of the conversation, the conversation of text and canon seem to go hand in hand. So thanks for being patient with that and still engaging. So anyways, that's all the calls I'm going to take, guys, today. So we're going to wrap it up here. James, I'll give you the last word, then I'm going to cut to my closing scene and go from there.
Getting back to the subject of the story of the woman caught in adultery, there's some other issues in play here that aren't really centered. We didn't cover the manuscripts with asterisks. This claim often comes up in commentaries that, well, there have been, somebody has marked this passage with asterisks, implying that it's not authentic. That implying that it's not authentic, it's like the commentator is an amazing telepath because he can tell why these asterisks are there. Often is completely wrong. There are about 270 copies that have asterisks next to the story of the woman caught in adultery. In about 130 of them, the asterisks only accompany chapter 8, 3 through 11, which is the election for St. Pelagia's Day. What has happened is not somebody said, oh, I've got this copy of the story of John with the story of the woman caught in adultery, but we all know that's not authentic, so I'm going to put these dots beside it. I'm not saying that never, ever, ever happened, but when you look at it, it looks like it's all related to the lectionary system, especially when you have asterisks next to John 8, 3 through 11, and not the verses before it. Is somebody saying, I accept these 3 verses at the front, but not the rest of it? No, that's not what happened. They marked the passage for St. Pelagia's Day's lectionary for the sake of the lector. So the lector would be reading the Pentecost lection, get to the part that he shouldn't read on that day, but also be able to easily identify the part that he should read when October came around. That's why those asterisks are there. All you need to do is say, well, they had this whole passage. They simply put the asterisk over the whole passage instead of just the part that was St. Pelagia's lectionary, St. Pelagia's lection. And that explains a lot of the asterisk. And if somebody has a manuscript where they say, I'm really sure that these asterisks, I'm reading the mind of these asterisks. I know for sure that he didn't put these asterisks here just for the sake of the lecture to show which part should be skipped. That's why the asterisks are there. If they could make a list of those, that'd be really handy, because many of the ones that I look at, it's clear that the asterisks are there simply to designate the election for St. Pelagia's Day. Nobody is wondering if it's authentic or not when they put asterisk next to verses 3 through 11, but not the previous 3 verses. Moving on from there, I think we can probably call it a day. I think that when you have an opponent of the PA saying during a debate, these internal points, they're not really reasons to accept or reject the PA. I think we can say, oh, okay, if you say so, let's move on to the external evidence then, and that's the direct go. And I think we saw that in the debate between Dr. Boyce and Dr. Riddle. So I hope viewers who've lasted this long can take the information that I've presented and do your own analysis, and I hope this has been helpful.
That's awesome. Hey, thanks again, James, for coming on. You're welcome on any time. And I know there's been people who have been requesting to see you actually debate somebody on either the PA or the longer ending of Mark. I would love to see that, and hopefully maybe we can get something set up to make that happen. But again, thanks for coming on for this debate review. I think it was fair. I think it was good for those who were watching and beneficial as well. So anyways, thanks again. Have a good night, and I'll catch up with you soon. So
thank you.
All right. Hey, guys.
Have me here.
Anytime, James. So I'm going to cut to this closing scene here and give you guys a heads up on what's coming up. This Monday night at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, I've got blown up pretty big there. So take a look at this. It's a colloquy, I think that's how you say it, which is just it's a good conversation, a normal, friendly conversation with Dr. Stephen Boyce and the Anglican autodidact Jonathan Sheffield over the PA. So we'll give Stephen a chance to respond to some of the things he's been accused of, some of the things that he thinks may have been misrepresented, and obviously he's going to be the critical text proponent, and Jonathan Sheffield is going to be he's a TR guy, and he's actually got a debate coming up. Not exactly sure 100% when it's going to happen, but he's going to debate Richard Carrier on the, what is it about? I can't remember exactly what he's doing a debate on, but he's debating Richard Carrier, so that should be good. Tune in Monday night, the 25th at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time for that. And then that following Saturday, I'm going to be debating the Eucharist with Matthew Broderick, and that's the 31st at 2 p.m. So anyways, guys, that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you for all of you who are writing in with your questions and called in as well. We need to keep that going. I think these conversations are important and need to continue to happen. So with that said, guys, God bless. I wish you the best, and